Every Saturday at noon, the smell of fried bologna filled the kitchen. Not from a restaurant, from a cast-iron skillet on a gas stove, flipped once by a woman who'd been making the same sandwich since 1962. She fed 4 kids that way, cost her about 30 cents. That sandwich is one of 60 lunches in this video that Americans used to make every single week. No fancy gadgets, no $15 ingredients, just real food from real kitchens. One of these recipes takes 5 minutes and costs less than $1 today. Another uses an ingredient most people just throw in the trash. And one was so common in 1974 that school cafeterias served it nationwide twice a week. Then something changed. Microwaves showed up, fast food got faster, and one by one these lunches disappeared from kitchen tables across the country. Nobody banned them. People just forgot. So hit subscribe and settle in, because here are 60 easy homemade lunch recipes from the 1970s that no one makes anymore. Number 19. The hot roast beef plate. This was what every truck driver ordered before the night haul out of Cleveland. The dish promised at the top of this list, and it earned that promise 3 times over. 2 thick slices of roast beef carved from a top round that had been in the oven since 6 in the morning, laid over a single slice of white bread that soaked up the juice. A separate mound of mashed potatoes beside it with a well in the middle for more gravy. Brown gravy ladled hot over everything until the plate was almost swimming. A side of canned green beans cooked down with bacon fat, and a hard dinner roll wrapped in cellophane. The roast beef plate was the meal a working man ordered when he had 4 hours of driving ahead of him and one chance to eat before the next stop. The waitress in her paper crown brought it on the same heavy oval platter she used for the hot turkey, and the chrome swivel stools spun a quarter turn every time he reached for the salt. The plate disappeared in stages. First, the roasting ovens went out of the counters because the gas bills climbed faster than the lunch crowd grew. Then the carving station went out because slicing meat to order made no sense once frozen patties existed. Then the gravy went out because the kitchens with no carving station no longer had pan drippings, and powdered gravy mix made every plate taste the same. By 1979, the hot roast beef plate had moved from the lunch counter to the church basement and the Union Hall, where volunteer cooks still roasted a real piece of beef. Now it lives only in the muscle memory of a generation of drivers who could tell you which exit had a counter that still served it. Number 16. Tuna melt. A short order rail one hot afternoon in 1959 tipped a bowl of tuna salad onto a half-grilled cheese sandwich and decided to keep going. The whole thing got pressed flat on the griddle and slid onto the plate. The customer asked for another. Within 3 years, the tuna melt was on lunch rails everywhere. Tuna salad on rye or sourdough, a single slice of cheese on top, a slick of butter on the griddle, heavy press for roughly 2 minutes each side. The cheese melted down into the tuna, the bread browned, the whole thing came off hot and a little messy. The fast food kitchens replaced the press with a panini machine, and the panini machine turned the tuna melt into something tighter and drier and entirely less interesting than the original. By the way, if any of these sandwiches sound like one your mother used to fix at home, I put together a recipe guide that walks through more like them. The proportions, the bread choices, the right way to cut a sandwich on the diagonal, and the small kitchen tricks the counter cooks use to keep the lettuce crisp and the bacon hot through a 6-hour shift. The link is just below. Number 19. Rectangle cheese pizza. A frozen sheet of par-baked dough, 14 inches by 20, came stacked 12 to a case from a regional supplier. The kitchen ladled tomato sauce from a tilt skillet, spread it with the back of a serving spoon, then covered the whole sheet with 1.5 pounds of low-moisture mozzarella from a 5-pound bag. 8 minutes at 500 degrees, then the cook pulled the pan and cut it into 24 perfect rectangles with a long-handled wheel cutter. Each rectangle weighed about 4 ounces. In 1987, the line cost added up to 65 cents per serving, like a coin you could trade across the lunchroom. That was the cheapest hot entree the federal program allowed. The crust was thicker than a takeout pizza, almost focaccia, with a thin glaze of oil on the bottom from the parchment. The cheese cooled into a single rubbery layer that you could lift in one piece and eat folded over. Friday was rectangle pizza day in most American districts. Kids who hated the spinach side and pushed the orange wedge to one corner would still finish your rectangle pizza in 3 bites and ask whether seconds were left in the warming line. Lunch ladies learned to count the rectangles by the 3rd class through because the 8th grade boys came through last and would eat anything still warm. The recipe came from a 1988 USDA standardized cookbook distributed to school food service directors across all 50 states. Sister Mary Catherine, in a Cleveland parochial school, used the same recipe word for word, only doubled. The 2012 nutrition standards changed all of it. The dough now must be whole grain rich, the cheese must be reduced fat, the sodium per serving must come in under 480 milligrams. The original rectangle pizza carries closer to 700 milligrams in a single piece. What most people forget is that the cheese formula itself changed too, not just the crust. A modern version exists, made with cauliflower flour and reduced sodium cheese. But the texture and the smell are not the same. A child from 1986 would not recognize the slice on your tray. Poke salad and egg sandwiches were spring's first gift after a long winter's wait. When pokeweed shoots pushed through thawed soil, foragers gathered them young before bitterness set in. The leaves were boiled 3 times to wash away poison, then chopped, drained, and fried in bacon grease until dark and rich. Layered with slices of hard-boiled egg between bread, it became a hearty field lunch, fresh, filling, and full of life. The greens gave a wild tang that spoke of earth and rain, while the eggs brought comfort and weight. It was food born from patience and care, a reward for knowing the land well enough to take only what it offered. In the mountains, such meals weren't poor. They were proof that nature always paid back in flavor and grace. Number 25, cold lard sandwich on day-old bread. 2 slices of bread 3 days past, soft, a heavy spoon of white lard from the can the family kept beside the stove, a hard pinch of salt, and the whole thing wrapped in butcher paper. That was the lunch a hosiery mill hand in Burlington, North Carolina, carried 6 days a week through the worst of the 30s. The lard came home in a blue and white half-gallon bucket from the corner grocer, and when the lard was gone, the bucket held nails on the back porch for 20 years. You ate it slow because the salt did the work the meat could not. And your grandmother did not call it a sandwich. She called it a working dinner. It cost about 3 cents to pack, and it kept a man on his feet for a 9-hour shift on the 2nd floor of a 4-story brick mill where the heat ran past 100 degrees from June to September. The bread came from a bakery on Main Street that sold day-olds for a nickel a loaf on Saturday. The wax paper she used to wrap each sandwich got smoothed flat and reused on Tuesday and Thursday, the way most things in that kitchen worked. The lard itself was rendered at home from the November hog, ladled into the same blue bucket year after year, and skimmed across the top like a cap of clean snow. It was the cheapest tablespoon of calories a poor woman could pack into her husband's pail, and it traveled through the Carolina Piedmont mills, the brickyards of Macon, the ropeworks of Charleston, and the lumber camps of the PD without spoiling, without crushing, and without complaint. A working dinner did not need to be good. It needed to be there at noon. Bread and milk bowl was the simplest possible lunch, yet it sustained seniors across America when appetites were small or budgets impossibly tight. This wasn't a recipe so much as a survival strategy, combining torn pieces of bread with cold or warm milk in a bowl, sometimes sprinkled with sugar. The bread softened in the milk, creating something between cereal and soup that required no cooking and minimal chewing. During the 1940s through the 1960s, many elderly folks turned to this combination when other foods seemed too heavy to prepare. The meal provided calcium from the milk and carbohydrates from the bread, offering basic nutrition when appetites had diminished. Some variations used stale bread specifically, since soaking in milk revived even the driest crusts. The dish cost mere pennies, making it accessible even during the leanest weeks before pension checks arrived. Children who visited grandparents often remembered seeing this humble bowl. Bread and milk bowl remains a powerful symbol of resourceful simplicity. Potatoes weren't the only option. They were great, but not the only ones. On days when people would naturally get too tired of eating potatoes, They would always go for things like baked bean sandwiches. This was a filling, no-fuss meal that was especially loved by working-class homes that were doing labor-intensive work. They were very common in the Northeast, the Midwest, and different parts of the South, especially where any kind of construction was going on. It was also really helpful that so many brands had come out with such accessible and easy canned beans. These were cheap, required no effort to cook, and the result was something you could use in a soup, a sandwich, or a casserole. It just depended on what you were feeling that day. Either way, you were going to get a delicious meal. One of the biggest reasons I think this was as popular as it was is because people really began to rely on it during the Great Depression. Another good reason is that this was the perfect lunch for your kids, and it was so low effort that making it wasn't a hassle at all. Spam and pickle sandwiches were one of those salty, tangy lunches you could whip together before the coffee even finished brewing. You sliced up spam, fried it in a pan, stacked it on soft white bread, and layered pickles over the top, done in under 10 minutes. It was not the prettiest meal, but it was fast, filling, and made with stuff most families already had sitting in the pantry. Spam was practically a food group during the lean years, and those jars of pickles stretched on forever, making this one of the quickest cheap lunches around. Some folks added mustard, lettuce, or even a slice of cheese if they had it, but most just kept it plain. Back then, nobody cared about gourmet ingredients or trendy recipes. Lunch was about survival, and a hot spam sandwich hit the spot when the cupboards were running bare. You would find this recipe scribbled on index cards, stuck in old cookbooks, or just passed along by word of mouth. It might sound like an oddball now, but back then, spam and pickles were a lunchroom classic that got families through tight days. Goulash Midwest style filled giant steel pans with elbow macaroni, ground beef, and a slow-simmered tomato sauce that could stretch to feed an entire cafeteria. The noodles soaked up the savory juices until every bite delivered both comfort and fullness, making it a reliable favorite when budgets were tight. Lunch ladies stirred vats of the bubbling mixture with long wooden paddles, and the smell of tomatoes and browned beef drifted down school hallways, luring students long before the bell rang. A sprinkle of dried oregano or a dash of black pepper was the only seasoning needed to make it feel like a special treat. Children returned for second helpings, knowing the warmth of that simple dish would carry them through the afternoon's lessons. It was hearty, inexpensive, and endlessly adaptable, a dish that symbolized how school kitchens turned plain staples into memorable meals. Goulash Midwest style remains a shining example of how resourceful cooking and a little spice transformed ordinary ingredients into a lunch many still crave today. Boiled carrot sandwiches was created from the weird culinary gap left by increasing prices and thinner savings accounts. Like we said, people wanted vegetables that ticked the cheaper and tastier most boxes for them. However, even that was getting tough. Some of the worst stretches of the Great Depression left people with frustrations and creativity alike. Whipping up dishes like this was common, and the boiled carrot sandwich definitely stayed during the time because of its simplicity. Americans love a good sandwich, and they adore an easy-to-cook filling. Boiled carrot sandwiches definitely met most of the criteria, as roasting cheese to create an open-faced sandwich was a popular choice. Suffering the same fate as other dishes on this list, the boiled carrot sandwich eventually died out as economic growth increased in America. Vienna sausages and saltines were not a meal, they were a dare. Tiny pink tubes floating in mystery juice, packed into a can that hissed when you opened it, like it knew it was about to be judged. You would drain them, maybe pat them dry, and line them up like little soldiers on a stack of saltines. No heat, no fuss, just raw, salty commitment. The crackers softened under the weight of the sausages, sometimes crumbling entirely. But you powered through because this was your lunch, and if you were lucky, there was mustard. Not fancy mustard. Yellow squeeze bottle stuff that cut through the meat-flavored monotony. It was not gourmet, it was survival. A lunch built for kids who knew how to eat without complaining. And maybe, just maybe, you started to like it. Maybe the weirdness became comforting. Like knowing you could always count on something so unapologetically odd to be waiting in your lunchbox. Kids today would never touch them. But back then, they were a rite of passage. Cold fish cakes are something you would never miss out on whenever you would visit any kind of coastal town. They were the product of combining flaked cooked fish, which was often just cod and haddock, with mashed potatoes, herbs, and different kinds of spice blends and rubs. Then, people would shape the fish meat into patties and fry them, giving you some high-class maritime comfort food. The char of cold fish cakes came from the fact that once you let them chill and cool down, they became even nicer. That's because the fish started to become firmer once it cooled down, and that meant the crispy outer shell as well, so that first bite was honestly addictive. Despite being such a fun dish, they have a pretty serious origin story. These were a popular leftover dish in both America and Britain, and pairing fish with potatoes was a budget-friendly way to stretch what you had in the pantry while getting a proper, healthy meal in. Also, some tartar sauce would turn this into a 5-star work meal. Savory oatcakes are as rustic of a snack as they come, but they're also a warm hug when it's your lunch break, and you can only think of how badly you miss home. Made with oats, flour, butter, salt, and water, these flat round cakes were the difference between powering through that last hour at work and handing in your notice period sometimes. You can either bake these or cook them on a griddle, but the end result is usually a chewy, dense, nutty oatcake with a hint of rich butteriness. Sometimes these would be made with herbs and cheese for extra flavor, but the classic oatcake was always something that was simple because it needed to be. Savory oatcakes were something you would see a lot in New England thanks to British immigrants, but they spread from there to almost every part of America in the 20th century. Now, as for egg and breadcrumb patties, these were really nice protein-packed meals that were also a wonderful way to make sure your family and household wasn't wasting any kind of bread. They were particularly popular in all kinds of farming families, and they were a pillar of Great Depression-era cooking. Stretching ingredients was really essential in these times, and it was pretty much how people lived for ages. This dish was a meat substitute that was great for coal mining towns and towns where industrial, labor-intensive jobs were more common. This is because it was such a good source of protein and energy while also filling you up. It made those really long work hours in the sun or in a mine a bit easier to get through, though let's be real, nothing was helping too much with that. The seasonings were very bare minimum though. Salt, pepper, onions, mustard, garlic were your typical picks. I mean, I know that sounds like a lot, but people would just pick different combinations of these and see what worked best for their pasties. The crunch and crisp on that first bite from the breadcrumbs, though, that was a work of art. Or milk toast was a common meal for many working class and poor Americans. This was doubly true if you were living in the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, like bean sandwiches, this is something that I feel was always just popular, but it was never really massively used like it was in these 2 centuries. It was very easy to digest, it was something that filled you up, and it was a great way to repurpose any stale bread you had. The appeal of milk toast was pretty good in that regard. You got a filling, sweet dessert out of it, and you also got to take care of any bread that was about to go bad. For low-income families, milk toast was a good way to stretch very limited resources. Stale bread works just fine with warm milk, and in rural areas where families had their own cattle and cows or access to fresh dairy at wholesale prices, it was even more of a thing. Number 22, chicken croquettes with cream gravy. These were the leftover Chicken Monday special at every drugstore counter from Lancaster to Little Rock. Ground cooked chicken bound with thick white sauce, shaped into cones or pyramids, rolled in cracker crumbs, and deep fried until the outside crackled. Served 2 to a plate over mashed potatoes with a pool of pale cream gravy and a side of peas. The trick was the binder. The white sauce had to be cold and stiff enough to hold the shape through the fryer. Hinkle's in Lancaster County is still making them from a recipe that has not changed since the 60s. Nobody else is. Croquettes died because frying twice-cooked chicken takes more labor than the modern profit margin allows. 2 minutes of hand-shaping proportion does not survive contact with a chain franchise spreadsheet. Number 24, leverwurst on rye with raw onion. The smell hit you before you saw the plate, like wet leather and pepper, and the bite of raw onion came right behind. Boar's Head sliced the loaf thick at every Liggett's drugstore in Brooklyn through the 50s. The counterman layered it on seeded rye with a sharp ring of yellow onion, a smear of brown mustard, and a single dill spear set off to the side. The sandwich was loud. The onion bit, the mustard cut through. The liverwurst itself was soft, a dusky pink paste of pork liver and fat that the immigrant butchers in Yorkville had been making for 30 years before it ever reached the rail. You could eat one standing up in 4 minutes and walk back to the shop full of it. But the kids would not eat organ meats anymore by 1975. The doctors were warning about cholesterol. By 2024, Boar's Head stopped making liverwurst entirely. There was a generation of countercooks who could trim a liverwurst loaf in their sleep, and there is no one left now to teach the next one how. Number 22, tater tots. They arrived in a 15-pound box from Oreida, frozen into perfect cylinders the size of a child's thumb. The cafeteria oven held 6 sheet pans at once, 400 degrees for 20 minutes. No flipping required. A scoop and a half went on each tray, salted from a steel shaker the lunch lady refilled every morning before the bell. Tater tots were the side that made every other side acceptable. You would push the corn around the compartment and eat the tots first, then dip the Salisbury steak in ketchup and eat it second, then drink the milk last. The pattern was as fixed as the bell schedule. Modern cafeteria fryers have been removed from most American elementary schools under the saturated fat rules. But the tots survive in some districts only as baked oven varieties, drier and lighter. The crispness is gone. Fried green tomato sandwiches were tart, crisp, and practical, born out of the need to use what the frost might ruin. Unripe tomatoes were sliced, dredged in cornmeal, and fried in bacon grease until golden. Layered between bread, they made a meal that traveled well and tasted like summer's last stand. Field hands loved them for the crunch, while homemakers loved that nothing from the garden went to waste. They were bright and sharp, the kind of food that woke your tongue after hours in the heat. Some folks added onions or a slice of cheese, but most ate them plain, still warm and oily in paper wrapping. It was a clever dish, built from what could not wait for tomorrow, carrying that same stubborn spirit that kept rural families going year after year. Number 19, hard-boiled egg and a pinch of salt. 2 eggs boiled hard in the same pot the family used for everything else, peeled at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning, then wrapped in a square of brown grocer's paper with a corner of salt twisted in like a pharmacy packet. A railroad shop hand at the Norfolk and Western Works in Roanoke in 1947 carried 2 of these in his pail every day for 26 years. You cracked the shell on the rim of the workbench and the salt spilled into the broken pieces of white. Some days, the yolk was still soft because the woman of the house had been called to a sick child the night before. But the egg was free if your family kept hens behind the rented duplex. It became the protein backbone of a Depression-era pail when meat was a Sunday item, and it stayed in the pail through the war and the post-war decade because the math had not changed. Bouillon with crackers provided warmth and comfort when appetites were small, but something hot seemed necessary. Those little cubes dissolved in boiling water to create a steaming cup of broth that cost mere pennies, yet delivered genuine satisfaction. For seniors living alone, bouillon represented the simplest possible hot lunch, requiring only a kettle and a mug. The broth's salty warmth felt nourishing, even when solid food held no appeal, making it particularly valuable during illness or on days when energy for cooking didn't exist. Crackers floating in the broth or eaten alongside provided substance, turning liquid into something approaching a meal. Beef and chicken varieties offered options, though many seniors kept both in their pantries. The cubes stored indefinitely and took up almost no space, making them essential emergency provisions. This wasn't lunch that anyone bragged about, but it served its purpose admirably. On cold afternoons, a cup of bouillon brought comfort that belied its simplicity. Handmade butter used to be a really simple kitchen staple at home, and it started to be reborn as a gourmet product when people really got into the crafts and works aspect of it. See, people like things they made on their own. It gives them a chance to show off on Instagram, it gives them something to talk about with their friends, or it just becomes something cool to speak about on a date. You know, a cute and quirky little fact about yourself that helps break the ice. Besides that, there's also the authenticity and uniqueness of a completely 100% homegrown and homemade product. In a world full of preservatives, food dyes, artificial flavorings, and added vitamins and minerals, something that's actually just made out of the stuff God put on Earth and nothing else is a relief. The revival of artisanal butter throughout the 2000s to today was really helpful in giving it a new image. High-end restaurants started serving cultured butters, and they even started putting hand-churned ones up for sale. There was a premium price you had to pay, but man, the suburban moms fell for it so bad. Fried bologna with mustard on toast was the quick stovetop lunch that somehow managed to taste better than it had any right to. You sliced bologna, tossed it in a hot pan, watched it curl up at the edges, and slapped it on toasted bread with a smear of yellow mustard. That was it. Lunch in under 10 minutes. It was salty, tangy, crispy around the edges, and showed up everywhere from lunch counters to kitchen tables when the grocery list was running short. Bologna was cheap, lasted forever in the fridge, and frying it gave it just enough of a glow-up to make it feel like more than sandwich meat. Some folks added a slice of cheese or swapped in rye bread, but the classic stayed simple and fast. Fried bologna with mustard was not glamorous, but it hit the spot when you needed something filling, salty, and satisfying without much effort. It was a staple in school lunchrooms, factory break rooms, and busy homes, sticking around because it was affordable, reliable, and always ready when the clock was ticking. Oven-fried chicken drumsticks let schools offer crispy chicken without the mess of deep frying, using a clever shake-and-bake method that kept the meat juicy. Seasoned flour or breadcrumbs clung to each drumstick, creating a crunchy coating as the chicken roasted in large convection ovens. The scent of sizzling poultry and toasted breading filled the halls, making stomachs growl long before lunch began. Children loved the satisfying crackle of the crust, followed by tender, flavorful meat beneath. Served with mashed potatoes or buttered rolls, it felt like a Sunday family meal in the middle of the week. Kitchen workers appreciated how the oven method allowed them to prepare hundreds of pieces at once without hot oil, keeping things safer and simpler. Oven-fried chicken drumsticks captured the balance of efficiency and comfort, proving that school lunches could deliver real flavor even on a tight schedule. For many, that golden drumstick remains an unforgettable taste of 1960s cafeteria dining. Brown Betties were one of the most classic American desserts to ever grace the table of an American kid. Something that might be seen as an old-fashioned dessert now, but used to be the next best thing after an apple pie. The flavors of a Brown Betty usually come from the spiced apples and other fruit-layered dishes, which are really buttery. The sugary breadcrumbs on top give it a crunch, which really adds to the entire vibe of the Brown Betty. You're looking for a warm, comforting dish that gets you in a nostalgic mood. Something you can sit down with and enjoy bite for bite, not rush through. It's an experience that you want to savor, like an empty, windy street as you walk down by and enjoy it. The Brown Betty was definitely something that would get you up out into the street, whether you were going to visit your grandma's for an authentic pie or a nearby bakery to reminisce about childhood days. The earliest recipes you can find are the ones from 1866, but those are more like apple betties than the ones we're talking about. Either way, this dish has definitely evolved alongside the population, and those who grew up with it will remember it fondly. Jell-O salad with shredded carrots was a betrayal that somehow got passed off as a side dish for decades. It looked like dessert and tasted like confusion. Your fork would go in expecting sweetness and come out with carrot bits clinging to neon green gelatin. No one knows who started it. Some say it came from the church potluck crowd. Others swear it was a prank gone too far. Either way, it ended up on cafeteria trays and family tables alike. You could not escape it. Lime Jell-O was the most common offender, but there were worse versions: orange, lemon, and the truly cursed cherry with celery. Moms called it a salad, so you would eat it. But there was no lettuce, no dressing, just the jiggling horror of a dessert that desperately wanted to be a vegetable. It was served with pride, too. People molded it into rings, decorated it with pineapple slices, and acted like it was gourmet. You had to pretend to like it, not out of politeness, but because the grown-ups genuinely thought it was good. It was one of the strangest culinary gaslights of the 20th century. And somehow, it stuck. Pickled egg and bread is one of those old-school snacks that kind of raises an eyebrow when you first hear about it, but once you try it, you actually end up firmly seated on the bandwagon. It's exactly what the description on the tin says too. It's a pickled egg, usually drowning in vinegar and different kinds of tangy complementary spices, with a slice of plain buttered bread or a soft roll. No fancy layering, no Worcestershire sauce or anything, just the classic sharp punch of a pickle, balanced by the familiar, comforting tastes of egg and bread. Flavor-wise, this is a full-on vibe. The egg has a really nice texture that goes wonderfully with the pickles, and the acidic kick from the pickled brine really helps to contrast with the richness of the yolk of the egg. You take that, mix in some warm buttered bread, and you get yourself a meal that's the whole package. Creamy, soft, chewy, sharp, tangy, and whatever other flavor profile you can guess in your head. Pickled eggs are actually something that you'd find in New England more than anywhere else in America, but they've always been something of a working. Call this the decade of casseroles for no reason. A vegetable and rice bake was an extremely low-effort, simple and affordable casserole that became very common among working-class families in factory towns. It was also really common in farming communities throughout most of the 1970s and 1940s because it was a very easy way to stretch lots of vegetables and rice into this family-sized portion. It did all that without really cutting into your pantry either. Rice was one of the most affordable grains you could buy, and if you had a paddy field to grow them on, then that was even better. In Southern and Midwestern households, canned and frozen vegetables were always stocked as much as they could be. They were available throughout the year, most people bought them in bulk, and they were rationed out throughout the months. Now, this could even include little bits of meat if you liked it like that, but most people decided to keep it strictly on the vegetarian side. Why? Well, there's just a lot of meat dishes, especially casseroles already. And besides, with all the vegetables that people were packing into this, it was a nutritional powerhouse. Seriously, this was the kind of thing you'd take for your kids when you wanted them to grow up big and strong and everything. Factory and mill workers were always bringing these in as there were almost always leftovers to go around. Was bread with meat drippings. Despite what you might think, this is really just stale bread with leftover drippings that were squeezed out. People weren't fond of letting the drippings go to waste back then. They could be used as a cooking fat, as a dip, or as a coating to increase flavor. Poor people would generally try their best to keep a steady supply of them. This was also one of the most popular meals to come out of the Great Depression because of how economical it was. It also luckily worked better with bran and rye bread instead of the fluffy, white wheat flour one we're used to. That meant that the dish was able to hit a bigger audience because a lot of people were barred from ever being able to buy fluffy white flour-based bread. These were okay, really. Just an average breakfast to get you started, but they were wonderful at stretching out the pantry and making sure things stay for as long as possible. Also, if there's ever something you need toast for, but you're just out of butter, syrup, or whatever, this is a pretty okay alternative. Number 15, chicken a la king in a pastry shell. This was the white tablecloth dish that lunch counters dressed up for ladies who came in from the department store upstairs. Diced, cooked chicken simmered in a cream sauce with sliced mushrooms, pimentos, and green peas, ladled into a baked puff pastry vol au vent the size of a teacup. A sprinkle of paprika on top for color. Schrafft's served this through 1972 in their Midtown locations. The dish was a Schrafft's signature, and when Pet Incorporated bought the chain in 1967, they tried to modernize the menu and quietly stopped pre-baking the pastry shells. After the shells went, the dish became just chicken and cream sauce on toast, and it lost the only thing that made it special. By 1980, the last of the Schrafft's locations had closed, and the pastry shell had no other counter to live in. Number 11. Hot brown. Imagine you are a hotel chef in Louisville in 1926, working a dinner dance that has brought 1,200 guests through the doors of the Brown Hotel and will not let them leave. His name was Fred K. Schmidt, and he had 30 minutes to feed everyone. By midnight, the dancers wanted a fourth meal, and he did not have time to plate ham and eggs for 1,200 people individually. So he laid open-faced slices of toasted white bread on a sheet pan, fanned roasted turkey breast across them, draped 2 strips of bacon over each, ladled a thick Mornay sauce made from butter, flour, milk, parmesan, and a dash of nutmeg poured generously across the bread, and slid the pan under the broiler. The cheese bubbled, the bacon crisped, the toast browned at the edges. He plated each one with 2 halved tomatoes alongside, and the guests fell on it. Within a year, 95% of the hotel's customers ordered nothing else. The part that really surprised me digging into the records is that he served it with 2 halved tomatoes on the plate, never one, a small thing nobody mentions in the modern recipes. The grilled tomato halves cut the richness of the Mornay and reset your palate between bites. By 1948, every drugstore counter in the South had a version. The hot brown was a cousin of Welsh rarebit, but it had a turkey under the cheese, and that made it American. The dish required a real Mornay sauce, a real broiler, and a cook who could time the bubble like a kitchen version of a magician's reveal. As the counters cut staff in the 70s, it went off most menus. The Brown Hotel still serves the original. A handful of Louisville restaurants still serve the original. Outside Kentucky, you can drive across the country for a week and never see one listed. Your grandmother in Bowling Green could tell you exactly which restaurant did it best because she had eaten her way down the list of them in 1957. Number 13, mashed potatoes with brown gravy. The potatoes came as dehydrated flakes in a 50-pound bag from the USDA commodity program, reconstituted with hot water, butter, and a splash of whole milk in a steam kettle. A wire whip on a long handle blended them in 3 minutes. The brown gravy came from a powdered base mixed with hot water in a smaller pot. A number 12 scoop dropped a perfect dome of potatoes on each tray like a small white hill, and a 4-ounce ladle covered it with gravy. The gravy ran down the slope and pooled in the corner of your compartment, and you would dip a tater tot in it before the corn even hit the tray. The 2012 standards did not pull mashed potatoes outright, but the powdered gravy disappeared because of the sodium count. The new gravy is thinner and tastes nothing like the version a 1986 kid remembers. Potato cakes from leftover mash were the quiet heroes of mountain kitchens. You mixed yesterday's mashed potatoes with flour, salt, and maybe an egg if you had one, then fried them in lard until the edges turned crisp. They were soft inside and golden outside, wrapped in cloth to stay warm for the noontime break. Whether eaten with onions or just plain, they were the kind of food that filled the stomach and felt familiar. They started as supper leftovers but became a comfort in their own right, passed from hand to hand in lunch tins and brown paper. Nothing fancy, just good sense and good flavor. Every family had their way of making them, but they all shared the same goal, stretching a meal into tomorrow. Number 24, Cornish pasty wrapped in newspaper. A folded half moon of pastry stuffed with diced beef, potato, onion, and a single turnip. Cornish miners brought the recipe across the ocean to the anthracite seams of Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, and the Iron Range of Calumet, Michigan. A miner's wife crimped the edge into a thick rope so her husband could grip it with coal-black fingers and eat without putting it down. She cut his initials into the corner so he could find his pail in the crib room when 40 men ate at once. One end of the pasty held meat and root vegetable, but the other end held stewed apple, sealed off so the savory side did not bleed into the sweet. The crust along the top edge she left thick like a handle, and that thick crust was for the knockers, the spirits the miners believed lived in the dark seams of the mountain. You left your crust on the rib of the gangway and walked away before the next blast. Number 24 did not need a fork, a plate, or a clean hand, and that was the entire point. Creamed corn on toast transformed a humble canned vegetable into a warm, comforting lunch that could be ready in minutes. Seniors living alone during the 1950s and 1960s often kept cans of creamed corn stacked in pantries, knowing they could heat one on the stovetop and pour it directly over buttered toast for a filling midday meal. The cream-style corn needed no additional preparation. its thick texture clinging to the bread while the natural sweetness balanced the butter's richness. Some cooks added a dash of black pepper, but the dish required no elaborate seasoning to satisfy. For those on fixed incomes, creamed corn represented remarkable value at roughly 15 cents per can, enough to top 2 or 3 slices of toast. The combination provided both carbohydrates and vegetables, offering balanced nutrition without complicated cooking. This was practical food for practical people, requiring only a saucepan and 5 minutes of attention. Though largely forgotten today, creamed corn on toast once filled stomachs across America. I know for a fact you've all grown up on some of your grandparents' baked ziti, especially if you have some Italian roots, and if you do, then you share that in common with this dish. Right from the streets of Italy, immigrants first brought this dish over in the middle of the 19th century throughout the early start of the 20th one, so it had a lot of time to become something that people could love and associate with the finer things in life. People had a lot of time by the mid-20th century to try this dish, and plenty of families had passed their own secret baked ziti recipes down. The baked ziti really hit its highest highs during that time period in the 1950s to the 1970s, and it was something you could enjoy at both a potluck and a fancy-at-home date. It was a staple of Italian-American cooking, and you could even find it at weddings. I, for one, think that really speaks to how popular the dish was, but what's your experience with this dish? And if you don't have any yet, is it something you'd ever try out? Hot dog and cheese roll-ups were the lazy day lunch every kid begged for, and every parent threw together when the cupboards looked bare. You flattened a slice of white bread, laid down a piece of cheese, rolled in a hot dog, and either microwaved it or crisped it up in a pan. It was fast, cheesy, and exactly what you needed when there were hungry mouths and barely any groceries. Some folks sliced them into little bites for parties or potlucks, but most families just ate them whole with a squirt of mustard or ketchup on the side. These roll-ups showed up in almost every old-school cookbook under quick meals or lunches for kids, because they made one pack of hot dogs stretch a long way. You could make a whole tray of them in minutes, which is why this quirky little lunch became a go-to when time and money were both running low. It was not fancy, but it filled you up, and that is what counted. Creamed turkey over mashed potatoes brought a taste of holiday leftovers into an ordinary school day. Chunks of tender turkey simmered in a silky white sauce until every piece was coated in rich gravy. Scooped generously over a mound of buttery mashed potatoes, it was the kind of lunch that filled stomachs and soothed spirits in the middle of math class. The aroma of roasting poultry and warm milk gravy floated down the halls, calling every student like a quiet invitation. Even those who claimed they were not hungry somehow found room for seconds when the lunch lady offered. The sauce pooled at the edges of the tray, perfect for sopping up with the soft dinner roll that always came alongside. It felt like a small feast, a comforting reminder of family dinners even on a gray school afternoon. Many still remember that first spoonful melting across potatoes, a warm hug on a chilly day that no modern cafeteria menu can match. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. Pickle and cheese roll-ups were the kid version of adult charcuterie, except nobody knew what charcuterie was back then. It was just a dill pickle, wrapped in a slice of processed cheese, maybe stabbed with a toothpick if your mom was feeling fancy. Sometimes ham got involved, sometimes not. Either way, it was salty, slippery, and weirdly satisfying. This was the kind of lunch your mom packed when she was out of bread, but still wanted to say, "I tried." Velveeta was the cheese of choice, because it bent, folded, and clung to the pickle like it had something to prove. You would pull it out at the lunch table and immediately get reactions. Some kids gagged, others begged for a bite. There was no middle ground. It was all crunch and chew and tang, a flavor bomb that somehow felt refreshing and heavy all at once. Keto kids today might think they invented the idea. They did not. We were rolling pickles in cheese before it was cool, and definitely before it was considered healthy. It may have looked like a lazy lunch hack, but back then, it was a declaration of resourcefulness. Meal. This was a meal right out of the 50s and 60s, and funnily enough, this was something that was marketed by the Cheese Bureau in Britain so that cheese sales could go up a lot. And so the thing back then with lunch was that you really wanted it to be portable. You didn't have a little deli on the corner with a killer quesadilla or Uber Eats back then. Dishes were often made with energy and transportability in mind, and that's why stuff like meat hand pies got as popular as they did. Not only were they really easy to stuff in your bag and walk around, but they were resistant to getting spoiled, so they could stay in there for quite a while if you got your break late, no worries. As far as the taste went, it goes down just like any meat pie, though most people were fond of using different cuts of pork and ground beef. A historical act about these is that during the 19th century, they were pretty much the ideal lunch for Cornish tin miners. The reason was that since mine workers usually had dirty hands, they would grip the pie by the edge of the crust and eat the rest, throwing away the part that got dirty. They got popular because of how satisfying the flavor is, though. It's rich and meaty, and that buttery crust with a peppery seasoning only helps to elevate this humble pie into a proper midday lunch. Potato and onion sandwiches are still something that I can see working today. They just feel a lot more closer to the realm of sanity than putting mayonnaise on bananas. Potatoes and onions together are a classic combination that has never failed anyone, and they weren't going to break that record in our country either. They became a hit in the Appalachian areas and the South, and there was an incredible need among the public for their regular fixing of potato and onion sandwiches. This was also one of the few meals you could have that would be entirely free. If you had the luxury of having your own land to grow plants and crops on, no matter how big or small, you definitely wanted to take advantage of potatoes and onions. They were very easy crops to grow, and having them meant a nice supply of food right out of your own home. If you didn't have room to grow anything, which is pretty understandable especially for office workers in big urban cities, you could always just buy one of these. It was so cheap it may as well have been free anyway. Grits and butter were a foundational meal for a lot of different kinds of poor families, but this was particularly true for anybody living in the South. This was even more true for black sharecroppers and tenant farmers. Working-class white families survived most of the 19th and 20th centuries off of foods like this too, but it really cemented itself as a staple of the black community back then. Corn was one of the most widely grown crops in the South, and grits, which were just ground hominy and cornmeal, were a very nice byproduct. Plus, back then, people lived and died by the waste absolutely nothing mentality. They would not let any byproduct go to waste because why should they? It was something they could get in bulk for literally a few pennies. Plus, just like rice and potatoes, grits provided an incredible amount of stamina and energy. Laborers often were also poor and did not have the money to really buy elaborate rations or pick and choose their nutrition, so starchy, fibrous foods were their best friends. Number 16. Howard Johnson's fried clam strips. This was the dish the chain built its reputation on, and the dish that disappeared with the chain. The strips were the foot of the hard-shell sea clam, dipped in a thick, crinkly batter and fried to a deep golden brown. Served in a paper-lined basket with hand-cut fries and a small paper cup of tartar sauce, $8.50 for the tender sweet dinner in 1978. Jacques Pepin himself reworked the batter formula in the 60s. Howard Johnson's ran more than 1,000 restaurants at the peak. By the end of the 70s, the chain was bleeding locations. The clam supply tightened, the franchise model broke, and the orange roof started coming down one town at a time. Today, 2 Howard Johnson's locations remain, in Bangor and Lake Placid, and the fried clam strip is functionally extinct everywhere else. By the way, real quick, before we get to the next one, if these dishes are bringing back the kind of meals you grew up eating, the recipe guide linked under this video has the printable cards for the cream gravy, the white sauce for the chipped beef, and the cherry phosphate syrup you used to be able to buy in a brown apothecary bottle. Everything tested in a home kitchen, no special equipment. Link is in the description. Now back to the countdown. Number 12. Pimento cheese on rye. At Augusta National in 1947, a couple named the Herndons sold pimento cheese sandwiches on the course for 25 cents apiece, and the recipe spread from there to every drugstore counter in the South within a decade. The mix was sharp cheddar, grated coarse, jarred pimentos drained and chopped, mayonnaise, a pinch of cayenne, and black pepper, all stirred until the orange paste held together but still showed the red flecks. You ate it on rye, white, or pumpernickel, cold, with a sweet pickle and a glass of sweet tea. A Walgreens in Atlanta listed pimento cheese on rye for 30 cents in 1955. A Liggett's in Charlotte ran a Saturday special at 20. The pimento cheese sandwich has held on better than most on this list. Even so, the drugstore counter version is gone. The lunch counters that built their reputation on this sandwich were inside Woolworth stores that desegregated in 1960 after 4 students sat down and refused to leave for 5 months running. The counters kept their stools through 1993 and then closed for good. The sandwich outlived the counter that made it famous, which is the strangest small monument the food world has. Number 17. Spaghetti with meat sauce. The pasta came in 20-pound bags of dry strands, boiled in a 30-gallon kettle until a piece thrown at the wall stuck for 1 second and slid off. Kids who walked past the kitchen at 10 in the morning could smell the simmering tomato and oregano halfway down your hallway. The sauce was ground beef, canned tomato puree, garlic powder, oregano, and a pinch of sugar. A wire scoop fished portions of pasta out of the kettle, like a net pulling shells from surf, and a 6-ounce ladle dropped sauce on top. The serving line moved fast on spaghetti day. Kids with braces dreaded it and ate the garlic bread first. Sister Joan in a Pittsburgh Catholic school served the same plate every Tuesday for 19 years, with a sprinkle of dried parsley, because she said it made the sauce look fresher. The 2012 standards limited white pasta to 1 serving a week per child, and the recipe disappeared from most menus. Cornbread and buttermilk in a jar was one of those hill country meals that told you everything about the people who made it. It was called a liquid lunch, though there was nothing fancy or store-bought about it. Crumbled cornbread went into a glass jar, and then cold buttermilk was poured over it until it soaked every crumb. On hot days, that jar came straight from a spring house or well bucket, cool enough to wake a man right up. You would shake it, maybe add a pinch of salt, and drink it thick like a meal. It was cheap, simple, and almost impossible to ruin, which is exactly why it became a favorite among farmers, mill hands, and anyone working under the sun. Some swore it was better than anything cooked fresh because it filled your belly without slowing your body down. It might not look like much, but that mixture of tangy milk and gritty bread was the South's version of endurance, comfort disguised as thrift. Number 23. Fried bologna on white bread. A thick coin of Oscar Mayer bologna scored across the middle so it would not curl in the skillet. Fried in bacon grease until the edges blackened, then dropped onto sunbeam white bread with a stripe of French's mustard. In Pittsburgh, a pound of bologna and a loaf of bread carried a steelworker's pail through the whole week. The mill at Homestead ran 3 shifts, and the men packed the same sandwich for 30 years because nothing else held up under the heat near the open hearth. You ate it cold by the time the 11 o'clock whistle blew. The bologna had set into a chewy disc, and the mustard had soaked through 1 corner of the bread. It cost about 11 cents to pack in 1953, but now you cannot find a real one outside a Pittsburgh diner, and the diner charges $9 for the sandwich your great-grandfather ate for a dime. Vienna sausages and crackers served as the self-contained lunch that required no cooking, no refrigeration, and no cleanup beyond disposing of the can. Those small, soft sausages packed in briny liquid provided ready-to-eat protein that seniors living alone could access whenever hunger struck. A can cost roughly 15 cents and contained enough sausages to pair with crackers for a complete, if modest, midday meal. The sausages had a mild flavor and tender texture that some found comforting while others tolerated as practical sustenance. Eaten straight from the can with crackers, this lunch could be assembled in under 10 minutes without dirtying pots or pans. For elderly folks on fixed incomes, Vienna sausages represented protein that lasted indefinitely and required nothing beyond opening the can. Some included mustard for dipping, but many ate them plain. The lunch carried associations with simple times when elaborate preparation seemed unnecessary. Vienna sausages have largely disappeared from consideration as proper lunch fare. Love that. So, squash might not be our top pick on a regular day, but Grandma's squash casserole was so irresistible that we found ourselves going back for seconds, or even thirds. This casserole was a staple in Southern cuisine and was Graham's favorite way of sneaking nutrients into our dinner. Squash is rich in vitamins A and C, potassium and fiber, making it a wholesome choice. Now, this dish was typically famous in the summer when squash was available in abundance, but you could freeze the veggie and enjoy it all year round too. Squash casserole was highly customizable, meaning Graham could tweak it by adding cooked bacon, sausage, or even fresh herbs. The secret ingredient that gave this bad boy its unique taste was a dash of hot sauce, so next time you attempt making this dish for a potluck, don't forget the key ingredient. Thank me later! Egg salad with sweet pickle relish was the batch-made lunch that carried families through hot summers, last-minute picnics, and quick work breaks. You boiled up some eggs, peeled them, chopped them, mixed in mayo, sweet pickle relish, a little salt and pepper, and scooped the whole thing onto soft sandwich bread or rolls. It was creamy, tangy, and came together fast, especially if the eggs were boiled ahead of time. Old cookbooks loved this one because it was practical, frugal, and ready in under 10 minutes if you planned right. It filled up hungry bellies when grocery money was tight, and kids happily took it to school tucked in wax paper wraps. Some folks dressed it up with celery or paprika, but the sweet pickle relish was the real shortcut, adding just enough kick to brighten up plain eggs and mayo. You would find this recipe in faded lunchbox guides, community cookbooks, or scribbled on note cards in kitchen drawers. It might not win awards today, but back then, it was one of those quick, comforting lunches that kept families fed when every dollar counted. Macaroni and tomato casserole was a true budget hero, filling plates and hearts with nothing more than pasta, stewed tomatoes, and a dusting of cheese. Elbow macaroni boiled in giant pots before being folded into a thick tomato sauce seasoned with onions and a touch of pepper. A light sprinkle of grated cheddar melted into a gentle crust during baking, sealing in the comforting aroma. When the lunch bell rang, the scent of tomatoes and cheese floated through hallways, drawing students with its home-style promise. Each bite brought the tender chew of macaroni and the sweet tang of slow-cooked tomatoes, a combination that felt both hearty and familiar. Children returned for seconds, not because it was fancy, but because it was filling and warm on cold days. Macaroni and tomato casserole turned simple ingredients into a meal that carried students through the longest afternoons and remains a beloved memory of uncomplicated cafeteria fare. Prune pudding was one of the more niche dishes that were created during the Great Depression. What really was surprising was that prune pudding extended to the upper royalty as well, since even prominent VIPs would also be real low budget with how they eat. Prune pudding became very popular as a result of the efforts made by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who would serve prune pudding at White House functions. It stained the White House's culinary track record, sure, but earned massive points with the struggling American people. For being made of such a simple ingredient and some syrups of your choice, it was definitely one of the tastiest and cheapest meals to come home to. Egg drop soup for some royal courts was a show of a chef's skill. In 1930, America, the soup became a beloved soup of the masses who were struggling to make an honest paycheck. Bread from last night and eggs beaten so thoroughly that the preparation itself doubled as a forearm workout resulted in an incredibly rich soup. Sometimes, if a home cook felt particularly fancy, they would have chicken either boiled or shredded in the mix. Using the chicken stock was also a common way to not let anything go to waste, since getting the most bang for your buck out of poultry became a habit of everyone. Most would just have this with eggs and throw in some ginger, chives and olives, or anchovies. We would definitely like to see this make a comeback with a less cost-oriented version that really explores the dish. SpaghettiOs in a thermos were never hot. That was the unspoken truth everyone knew, but no one dared admit. They started hot, sure, bubbling on the stove in that cheerful red can. But by lunchtime, they were lukewarm at best, trapped in a metal container that always smelled slightly like old soup. And yet, those lukewarm pasta rings were magic. A swirling alphabet of childhood comfort, swirling in that iconic orange-red sauce. It was not Italian food, it was not even pasta, really. It was SpaghettiOs, and that was enough. Kids would open their thermos with a dramatic twist, steam barely rising, and proudly take a spoonful like it was gourmet. Because it was not just about taste, it was about ritual, about having something warm in a sea of cold sandwiches, about having a lunch that made you feel like home followed you to school. You knew you would burn your tongue on the first bite and still go in anyway. It was worth it. Even when the sauce stained your shirt or your spoon got lost at the bottom of the thermos, you would do it again and again. Stew in a thermos is really a classic. This is something that combines a lot of different things to make a unique meal that you wouldn't think of on your own. A thermos is something you usually use for drinks. It doesn't always have to be water, but stew's in there? Not really anyone's first thought. For those who need a warm meal right on the go, though, this was the most reliable thing in the world, especially when you would be working in the winter. Thick and tender chunks of meat mixed in with roto vegetables like carrots and potatoes and simmered in a rich and flavorful broth that gets thickened up even more with some flour and cornstarch. I mean, what's not to like? The flavor oozes out of that thermos as soon as you open it is next level. Stew in a thermos was a game changer for workers during the 50s and 60s. It didn't matter what your job was, whether you were a truck driver, worked a night shift in a factory, or ran numbers behind a desk. Even kids in school would take it along with them. The thermos lets you pack a hearty and warm meal that could pretty much survive hours inside the bottle without losing its essence. You had to have some trial and error here first, though, because most people would often make the stew too liquidy on their first try or two, and it would end up spilling over once you unscrewed the lid. Thermos-steeped stew became something of a regional favorite in northern areas where the temperature was really known to drop, and I think it's a cute little dish we could bring back today, too. Cucumber and onion sandwiches were a really simple and refreshing butter, mayonnaise, different kinds of spices, and sometimes bits of bacon and ham on top of cucumbers. See, now I don't know if you guys will agree with me, but cucumbers really have a good place in the world of sandwiches and burgers. They're one of the most light toppings you can add, they're abundant, they're good for you, that crunchy bite is immaculate, and they work well with most kinds of sauces. It's a really straightforward dish that can work with almost anything you happen to have on hand. And on a hot summer day, this was the perfect meal to eat for your work lunch. It was served as an interlude between the usual fried, oily, and greasy food most Americans were used to anyway. Onions were something that everyone always had, and this could work with fresh or stale bread. They were beloved mostly for their detoxifying effects and how refreshing a cucumber can be. Textile workers and coal miners in particular loved these because it would take the edge off. Another thing that people relied on rather frequently was cornmeal mush. I can't begin to tell you how much people loved cornmeal. From peasants to farmers to Native Americans and everybody in between the West and East, cornmeal was something that had really spread. It was like that one food of the nation that everyone just knew. Corn is one of the few things that grows as easily as it does in the United States, and it means that the potential for mass use is so strong. Cornmeal mush might not do well by today's standards because it's a rustic, simple dish, but back then this mush was enough to make your morning a bit more optimistically. When a lot of people had nothing else to eat, they would often turn to cornmeal. When people had no way of stretching their pantries until the next salary, there was little to go for. Corn was one of the few things people could make in 100 different ways, and it was virtually free or literally free if you had your own farming grounds. Number 12. The patty melt on rye. A thin oval patty of ground chuck pressed flat on the griddle, salt and pepper only, no fancy spice. A heavy tangle of yellow onions cooked down slow in butter on the cool side of the grill until they turned the color of caramel and went soft and sweet. 2 slices of caraway rye, buttered on the outside, with a slice of Swiss cheese laid against one and a slice of American laid against the other. The patty went in the middle, the onions piled on top, the bread pressed flat under a steel weight, and the whole sandwich came off the grill the color of a chestnut. The patty melt came down from Los Angeles in the late 40s out of a small chain of coffee shops run by a restaurateur named Tiny Naylor, and it traveled east through the Dupar's locations and the Norms and Sambo's lookalikes that followed. By the early 80s, most chain coffee shops had quietly replaced the patty melt with a regular cheeseburger on a sesame bun, because the rye bread had a shorter shelf life and the caramelized onions held up the line. Number 17. Tongue on rye with mustard. The slice was 1/4 of an inch thick, fanned across the rye in 3 overlapping pieces, topped with a smear of horseradish and a single round of yellow mustard. Beef tongue was cheap at the wholesale market on 14th Street, simmered for 4 hours with onions and bay leaves, peeled while still warm, and sliced cold on the bias. A tongue sandwich was 35 cents at Katz's in 1956. The flavor was rich and beefy, the texture more tender than brisket ever reached. The sandwich held its place on Jewish deli counters and corner luncheonettes through the late 70s. And then beef prices dropped. The immigrant generation aged out. The kids stopped ordering it. Katz's still serves it. Almost nobody else does. Your grandfather knew the rail cook by his first name, and the rail cook knew which mustard he wanted before he sat down. Number 14. The peanut butter bar with chocolate frosting. The bar was one of the most beautiful objects a 1980s cafeteria ever produced, and every child knew it. The recipe lived on a single index card in the lunch lady's binder. 1 pound of butter, 3 cups of peanut butter, 4 cups of powdered sugar, 6 cups of graham cracker crumbs, all mixed by hand in a stainless bowl the size of a baby bath. The mixture was pressed into a half-sheet pan, 1/2 inch thick, then topped with melted milk chocolate and butter, smoothed flat with the back of a long spatula, and chilled in the walk-in for 2 hours. The lunch lady cut it into 36 perfect rectangles with a knife dipped in hot water between every cut. A single bar weighed nearly 3 ounces and tasted like a Reese's cup pressed into a brick. Kids traded their orange wedges, their carrots, their entire entree for an extra peanut butter bar. A second grader in Akron once kept hers in your lunchbox for 3 days and rationed it in pencil eraser-sized bites because she did not believe she would ever taste anything that good again. The peanut butter bar appeared on the 4-week rotation exactly twice a month, and on the morning the bar was on your menu, attendance in some elementary schools rose by 7%. Older lunch ladies were said to bake an extra pan and tuck it into the warming oven for the teachers, because the teachers traded for them too. The bar had everything a 1980s child wanted in a single object. It was sweet, it was rich, it was salty under the chocolate, and it filled a small hand. And then in 2014, the new federal Smart Snacks rule capped your dessert serving at 200 kilocalories and limited the sugar to 35% of total weight. The peanut butter bar carried 460 kilocalories and well over half its weight in sugar. It was pulled from cafeteria lines in most American districts within 18 months. The recipe survives only in church cookbooks and in PTA fundraisers, and in the memories of the kids who walked past the dessert window in 1986 and saw the chocolate gleaming under the lights like a window in a candy store. Sorghum syrup sandwiches were sugar for the poor and fuel for the strong. A thick smear of dark syrup between 2 biscuits or slices of white bread turned into instant energy for men working fields or hauling timber. Sorghum grew easy in southern soil, and the syrup mills were the heart of many small towns come harvest season. The sandwich itself was sticky and simple, sweetness caught between starch, just messy enough to make it real. It was the kind of food children would sneak before chores, and grown folks would pack for long days when they needed something to push them through. Sorghum was more than a sweetener. It was survival in a jar, and it stayed good for months. The taste was rich, earthy, and honest, a little bitter around the edges, just like life itself. Number 12. Cold beans and bacon in a mason jar. Pinto beans simmered overnight on the back of the stove with a slab of streak of lean bacon, salt pork, and an onion. The next morning, a quart of the cold pot went into a ball mason jar and rode in the bottom of a black lunch pail to the Goodyear tire plant in Akron in 1948. The man unscrewed the lid at the cinder block bench at noon and ate it cold with a metal spoon and a square of cornbread. The fat had risen to the top in a thick white cap, and that cap got eaten first because that was your calories. Cold beans were not a punishment. They were lunch for 500,000 blue-collar men in the post-war years, and they cost $1 a week to make at home. This was not a recipe a magazine ever printed because the editors never met the women cooking it. They were Polish, Mexican, Black, Appalachian, Sicilian. The math was simple. 2 pounds of beans, 1 piece of pork, an onion, water, and the time the woman of the house could spare. The factory ran on it long after the men who built it were dead. Potted meat and crackers provided quick, shelf-stable lunch protein for seniors who needed no-fuss meals ready in moments. Those small cans of spreadable meat paste, often pork or chicken-based, cost mere pennies and required no refrigeration until opened. The meat spread easily on saltines, rye crisps, or Melba toast, creating bite-sized portions that could be eaten while reading or listening to the radio. For seniors living alone, this lunch represented pure convenience since crackers stayed fresh in sleeves and meat cans stacked neatly in pantries. The flavor was salty and intensely meaty, a little going far when spread thinly across crackers. Some added pickle slices or mustard to brighten the richness, though many ate the combination plain. The protein helped maintain energy through afternoon hours when larger meals felt burdensome. This wasn't glamorous eating, but it was practical sustenance, acknowledging the reality of cooking for one. Though still sold in stores, potted meat has disappeared from respectable lunch fare. For families with little more than pantry staples, stretching a meal was an art form. Tomato gravy. Over rice was a perfect example of how a handful of cheap ingredients could be turned into something warm, filling, and, on the right day, even delicious. Rice was affordable, easy to store, and could be cooked in large batches, making it a go-to base for struggling households. The tomato gravy itself was a simple mix of canned or fresh tomatoes, flour for thickening, and a little fat, usually bacon grease or lard, to give it depth. Some versions were smooth, others chunky, depending on what was on hand. When money was especially tight, even just tomato juice and water could create a thinner, more soup-like version. This dish had roots in the South, where tomato gravy was often served over biscuits. But during the Depression, rice became a common substitute since it was cheaper and stretched further. Leftovers weren't wasted either. Extra gravy could be poured over cornbread or mixed into the next day's meal. It was proof that a little creativity could turn a sparse pantry into a meal that still felt like home. Cheese dreams were the open-faced, melty sandwiches that turned plain old white bread into lunch in under 10 minutes. You laid out a slice of bread, topped it with American cheese, and stuck it under the broiler until bubbly and browned. If you had extras lying around, you could throw on a tomato slice or a strip of bacon, but most folks kept it simple. Cheese dreams popped up in every old-school cookbook as a lifesaver for hungry kids, rushed workdays or weekends when grocery shopping had not happened yet. It was one of those lunches that made the most of cheap pantry basics, but still felt warm and filling. The cheese bubbled up golden and gooey, the edges of the bread crisped up just enough, and lunch was done before you even had time to set the table. Families loved it because it tasted good, cost next to nothing, and required zero effort. It was one of those old-fashioned meals that looked like a shortcut but stuck around because it simply worked when time and money were both tight. Cabbage and noodles offered a humble yet satisfying lunch inspired by the Eastern European traditions many Midwestern families brought to the United States. Thin egg noodles were tossed with butter and braised cabbage until everything glistened with savory richness. A dash of black pepper and a sprinkle of salt were all it needed to shine, though some schools added onions for extra flavor. The aroma of slow-cooked cabbage filled the air, signaling a meal that was both thrifty and hearty. Students enjoyed the tender noodles and the slight sweetness of the softened cabbage, a combination that surprised even those who claimed to dislike vegetables. It was a warming dish perfect for chilly afternoons, proving that simple ingredients could create deep comfort. Lunch ladies served generous scoops that stuck to the ribs and fueled long hours of classwork and play. Cabbage and noodles may sound plain today, but in those lunchrooms, it was beloved, a quiet reminder of home-cooked heritage and shared traditions. Around the later half of the 20th century, there was this big public paranoia that had spread concerning health and the after effects of the way Americans had been eating. Thanks to all that rage, we got dishes like vegetable aspic cups. See, lots of Americans were coming home to an angry mom, a worried wife, or a dad who just kept saying he wouldn't pay for the doctor's fees when your eating habits would eventually circle back around to bite you. It kind of did set fear into people's hearts, especially since the arguments were so convincing. Who could deny that they were eating Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's like addicts back then, or even now? That's why there was this newfound room for fusion food or experimental recipes like vegetable aspic cups. Before, you could tell somebody about vegetables that were set in these tomato-flavored gelatins, and they'd just laugh at you. A chilled salad on top of that? But thanks to how easy convenience food culture had made things, with how you could just buy gelatin and frozen veggies whenever you needed, this was actually a really solid and healthy work lunch option. It came in a little metal tin with a key you had to crank open like a can of paint, and inside was a pinkish meat paste that somehow became the crown jewel of school lunches across the country. Deviled ham sandwiches on Wonder Bread were the kind of thing your mom would pack with the same confidence as someone handing you a gold bar. It was salty, it was tangy, and it had that uncanny ability to smell up the entire lunchroom in 5 seconds flat. There was no middle ground. You either prayed for a trade or guarded it like it was national treasure. And let us not forget the bread. Wonder Bread, so white and soft it almost melted when you touched it. It was less of a sandwich and more of an edible napkin wrapped around a meat mystery. Kids today could not even imagine something like this being edible, let alone desirable. But back then, it was what you looked forward to after recess. It was what reminded you that even if you forgot your homework, at least your lunch was unforgettable. Somehow, deviled ham became a status symbol for a very specific kind of childhood chaos. Scotch eggs are actually a funny one. You would most commonly associate them with pub culture in Britain, right? I mean, that's how most people think of them. That's their history too. People would get off work or get a lunch break and decide to hit the local pub with the lads for a few Scotch eggs. What really are they, though? A Scotch egg is just an egg packed with protein. It's a hard-boiled or soft-boiled egg that gets this blanket of seasoned sausage meat, and nestled inside that, it gets coated in breadcrumbs, upon which it gets deep-fried until it's completely golden brown. So yeah, it's definitely one calorically dense egg, but that also makes it perfect for work because you can carry 2 or 3 of these and they fill you up right away. The crust is exactly as crispy as you're thinking it is, by the way, and I know you're getting ideas of how succulent this must be to bite into. Let me tell you, you're right on the money. The spiced pork on the inside is something divine, and the creamy egg center just brings everything together for the perfect flavor experience. The flavors also change depending on what spices you use and what herbs you pair it with, so you can really experiment a lot with this dish. Mock chicken legs were a working-class classic. It was a dish that was born out of the worst times of the Great Depression, and it was something that particularly shined in Rust Belt cities. It was incredibly popular among immigrant communities. So, there wasn't any actual chicken in this, but using grounded pork or even veal hoe chefs would shape the meat into the form of a drumstick. Pork was significantly cheaper than chicken, especially drumsticks, and since this was made out of round meat and relied on being shaped, even less desirable cuts could work for it. Some even used mixes of veal and pork, and others even went as far as to make their own vegetarian-based versions using mushrooms, mashed potatoes, and other vegetables. They were served alongside similar vegetables to make sure the dish was as hearty as it could be, and it was actually pretty okay for the time. It's not something that you would ever pick over an actual drumstick or something that people think really mimics the flavor too well, but for something that was made out of the most bare-bones ingredients, it was actually pretty okay. Even school children would be eating this, and church and funeral gatherings were often known to serve these as well whenever they could. One of the best things people did is that they also repurposed stale breading with this dish by using it for breadcrumbs. They would fry those in lard, and it would actually be pretty okay DIY fast food. Hardtack and water is not really something you can say this about. Hardtack and water was literally something people only ate in the worst of times when they had absolutely nothing else to work with. A simple cracker-like biscuit made of flour and water was one of the most common foods in America for around 2 entire centuries. It saw so many different eras, events, and wars. People associated it with famine, regular inflation spikes, Civil War rationing, the Depression, and so much more. Seafaring traders would keep a steady stock of hardtack, and it was actually even more important for them. This is because next to cockroaches, diamonds, and titanium, hardtack might be the most indestructible thing on the planet. When the thing is stored properly, it literally can stay good for years without spoiling, and this is something that you'd usually expect of food that's been put through preservatives. Plus, the economical benefit was unmatched. With just some flour, water, and salt, hardtack was one of the easiest things to make at home. Also, one of the most boring things. Number 20. The tuna melt on rye. 2 slices of dark rye laid open on the flat grill. Tuna salad spooned onto one half, a slice of American cheese laid on top, a slice of tomato sometimes, and the whole thing pressed flat under a heavy steel bacon weight while the bottom turned mahogany brown. The cheese ran down the sides and stuck to the grill in little crisp, lacy bits that the cook scraped up with a spatula and tucked back onto the plate. Drugstore counters loved this sandwich because it used up tuna salad that had been sitting in the case since breakfast. The tuna melt left lunch counters when the flat grill left lunch counters. A panini press cannot make the cheese skirts. A microwave makes the bread go limp. The melt only works on a seasoned griddle with a weight, and nobody has the space for that anymore. Number 21. Banana mayonnaise on white. The first bite tasted wrong and right in the same instant. Sweet banana, salty mayonnaise, soft white bread. The mayonnaise was Duke's. The bananas were green-tipped, sliced thin, laid in a single overlapping layer. A sprinkle of salted peanuts on top when the jar held some. The sandwich was a Southern staple long before the Depression, like so many of the things this country eats without questioning. The bread was buttered on the outside on hot days to keep the slices from going slimy. The lunch counters that served it widely are gone now. The sandwich is still eaten in pockets across the Deep South. Most never try it. They are missing something honest. Number 25. Tomato soup with a grilled cheese triangle. The soup came from a number 10 can of Campbell's condensed, thinned with whole milk in a steam kettle the size of a kitchen sink. The cheese was a half slice of American on white bread, grilled in butter on a flat top until your bread shattered when you bit into it. Lunch ladies cut every sandwich on the diagonal because the triangle dipped cleaner than the square. The ladle held 4 ounces, served into a 5-ounce bowl with a paper napkin folded under it. You dipped one corner, then another, and learned the order by 2nd grade. Today, the same lunch would fail 4 federal rules at once. Whole milk in the soup, white bread, butter on the griddle, and canned sodium together push past 740 milligrams. And whole grain bread now carries the sandwich. The original belongs to memory. Cold biscuit sandwiches with molasses or fatback were the kind of lunch that got a man through a 12-hour day with nothing but grit and habit to lean on. The biscuits were always cold by the time the tin lunch pail opened, but that did not matter much. If there was molasses in the pantry, you spread it thick for sweetness. If there was only fatback, you tucked in a slice or two for salt and smoke. The biscuits themselves were usually baked from leftover dough at dawn, made tough enough to hold together through a morning in a jacket pocket. By noon, the edges had gone soft, and the smell of lard or syrup made the whole meal feel like home. These sandwiches were a bridge between the breakfast table and the next hard stretch of fieldwork, something made from what little you had but worth every bite. Each one carried a taste of someone's kitchen, and even in its plainness, it was love in its simplest form, wrapped in wax paper and patience. Number 18. Crackers and milk in a thermos. A green thermos of cold whole milk and a sleeve of premium saltines wrapped in wax paper. The Thermos Bottle Company introduced the first official lunchbox thermos in 1920, and inside 10 years, a third of the men working the cotton mills in Greenville, South Carolina, were eating this exact lunch 6 days a week. You broke the saltines into a battered tin cup, poured the cold milk over them, and ate it with a spoon while the spinning frame ran in the next room. The crackers softened into a kind of pale porridge that filled a stomach for 4 hours. A saltine sleeve cost about 6 cents in 1933, and the milk came from a neighbor with a Jersey cow on the back lot, 50 cents a week. Now this lunch is a YouTube clip your grandmother smiles at when no one else is in the room, the way a person smiles at a song they had forgotten they once knew by heart. Hot tomato soup with saltines represented perhaps the most iconic simple lunch for seniors living alone, combining warmth, flavor, and affordability in a single bowl. Campbell's condensed soup cost roughly 12 cents per can and stretched to serve one generously when mixed with water or milk. The soup heated quickly on the stovetop, filling the kitchen with familiar aromas that signaled lunchtime. Saltine crackers floated on top or accompanied the bowl, their salty crunch providing textural contrast to the smooth, tangy soup. For those eating alone, this lunch offered psychological comfort alongside physical nourishment since the warm bowl felt like care and attention. The soup's smooth texture went down easily for those with dental concerns. A sleeve of crackers lasted weeks, making them economical pantry staples. This pairing sustained generations of seniors through quiet lunchtimes, requiring minimal effort. Though soup cans remain on shelves, the ritual of crackers floating in tomato soup has largely faded from daily practice. Forage mushrooms didn't always lining our burgers and topping our pizzas. For a majority of its history, it was really just something people ate when things were super bad. There was nothing to eat and people basically just had to forage for whatever they could. The most popular of this was the button mushroom, but they definitely tried to forage as much as they could. Now, despite this, mushrooms were still considered really low class. People had just begun to associate it with nothing but poverty and hard times. It wasn't until the middle and the later end of the 20th century that mushrooms started to become a classic topping you'd see on not just burgers and pizzas, but steaks, chicken dishes, sandwiches, and all kinds of soups and stews. Basically, it's a mushroom world, and we're just living in it now. A big part of this is how canned mushrooms became so accessible. Another reason is that an interest in European cuisine led to a massive boom in cream of soups and cream of mushroom soups. Share some of your favorite mushrooms with us right now in the comments. Pimiento cheese sandwiches on white bread were the Southern lunchbox staple that quietly made their way into kitchens across the country. You made up a big batch of pimiento cheese, usually shredded cheddar, mayo, and little diced pimiento peppers, then slapped it between slices of soft sandwich bread. That was lunch, fast and done. If you were lucky, the batch had been chilling in the fridge overnight so the flavors had time to settle. It showed up everywhere, from school cafeterias to Sunday church gatherings, and you did not need fancy ingredients to pull it together. The filling looked bright orange and odd to anyone who had never tried it, but it was creamy, sharp, and surprisingly satisfying. Some folks added extras like sliced pickles or lettuce, but the plain version stuck around because it was quick, cheap, and kept everyone fed when time was tight. Old cookbooks had pages of pimiento cheese variations, but the classic stayed the same: easy, portable, and just filling enough to get you through the day. Turkey tetrazzini squares offered a clever twist on a post-holiday classic, transforming leftover turkey and noodles into neat, sliceable portions. Creamy mushroom sauce coated strands of spaghetti and chunks of turkey, all baked until the top formed a delicate golden crust. Once cooled slightly, the pan was cut into perfect squares that held together just long enough to reach a tray. The rich aroma of garlic and cheese drifted through the lunchroom, giving every student hope that today's meal would taste like something from home. Children loved the way each bite combined tender turkey, creamy sauce, and chewy pasta in one satisfying mouthful. It was a dish that made leftovers feel like a celebration, proving that creativity and thrift could produce something special. Turkey tetrazzini squares are a delicious memory of a time when nothing was wasted, and every holiday bird found a second life in the school cafeteria. Dandelion salad might sound like a fairy tale-like name for an incredibly frugal but delicious meal. By now, you might have noticed the scavenger vibe in terms of ingredients of the dishes so far. People making anything out of whatever they had on hand. Economic downturns often feature lifestyle changes, and the Great Depression was no other, sending people on a scramble to find and eat anything. Dandelion salad took scramble seriously as the meal involved finding and foraging dandelions. You would cut out all the roots, flowers, and waste to make the dressing for a very healthy salad. For people, especially those on a diet and a budget, this was a godsend. For a garnish, all people would usually put on it was lemon juice and olive oil, a dash of salt, and you were good to go at basically no cost. Kugel was not just peanut butter. It was an experiment in how far food companies could stretch the idea of flavored spread before people revolted. Banana Kugel, chocolate Kugel, even cinnamon. It came in a jar just like peanut butter, but the label had this psychedelic flair that practically screamed, "I was made in the 1970s." Your sandwich was suddenly a dessert, and not always in a good way. Some kids loved it. Others could not stomach it. But if your mom packed you a Kugel sandwich, you knew one thing for sure. You were not eating anything normal today. It stuck to the roof of your mouth like drywall paste and smelled like a bakery that had lost its identity. Nobody knew what to pair it with, so people got creative. White bread was the usual suspect, maybe with some jelly if you were brave. It was part sugar rush, part lunch, and part science fair gone wrong. And then, just as quickly as it arrived, it vanished. Like a fever dream with a screw-on lid. Now, it is a ghost of school lunches past, one that gets weirder the more you try to remember it. Mustard green wraps are something you actually started seeing in the office space more toward the end of the 20th century, specifically the 80s and 90s. Before I dazzle you with details of this wonderful wrap, let's talk about why that was. See, health scares were becoming an everyday fact of American life, especially with the drive towards animal cruelty-free meals and vegetarian diets. People were generally becoming more conscious about their lard/bacon grease/deep frying reliant lifestyles, and what that was doing to things like their blood pressure, cholesterol, and more. Mustard green wraps were one of those dishes that started popping up as a result of all of this. And essentially, you just take fresh mustard greens and wrap them with seasoned but not fried meats, beans, or even rice. Sometimes people would go purely vegetarian with them and throw in sautéed vegetables, but sometimes people would go the meat lovers route and use the green wrap as a little, well, at least I'm doing something kind of thing. The fun part about these is that they actually come from African American communities, and if you ever have the fortune of trying an authentic one from a Black mom, you really shouldn't pass up the opportunity. Macaroni and tomato soup bakes were an easy-to-handle casserole that was extremely hot in the working-class communities throughout the middle half of the 20th century. This was a dish that took elbow macaroni with canned tomato soup, and it was almost always Campbell's. A few more pantry staple ingredients would ensure an inexpensive and wonderful meal that maybe the kids would take a few rounds getting used to. For the adults, though, it was the best way to have comfort food on a budget besides potatoes. All you needed was cheese, milk, and eggs if they were available, but even without these, the dish could still be made. It just would not be as thick, rich, or as flavorful. The best part about this was that all you had to actually do was just boil the pasta and you would be set for the entire day. This could include bits of ground beef, bacon, or ham, whatever kind of protein is your choice really. But it could also be made creamy and with just aromatics and herbs. There was a lot of versatility with this bake, and that's because it was so simple. It made for a very flexible dish that could fit a lot of people's preferences easily, with almost none of the fuss you normally associate with homemade pasta dishes. This is so easy, even your teenagers could pick it up, really. Ketchup sandwiches are also in the same vein of I don't really have anything else here. It's definitely some bare-bones cooking, but when you're down on your luck financially, it's not really the time to be picky. Ketchup sandwiches were usually made with brown bread because whatever white bread you could buy, you could also just get a lot more like potatoes, root vegetables, and onions instead. Those things could be made into soups and stews, so there were very few disadvantaged people actively relying on white bread. Ketchup was also fairly different in the 20th century than it is here. It felt more natural, it had a stronger tomato flavor, and it was a lot cheaper. A bottle of Heinz doesn't cost anything but a few cents. What people would do is sometimes take the meat drippings idea and mix it in with these ketchup sandwiches. They would spread the drippings on the bread or use it as a dip, and if nothing else, it definitely added some more interesting qualities to otherwise usually stale bread. How about you? Have you ever satisfied your hunger with nothing but ketchup and bread when times were rough? Personally, I think that just wouldn't begin to really fill me. Number 17, liver and onions blue plate. This was the Tuesday special at McCrory's, the Thursday special at Newberry's, and a standing order at every counter that still believed in iron-rich meals for working men. A thick slab of calf's liver dredged in seasoned flour and pan-fried in bacon fat. A heavy tangle of yellow onions cooked down slow until they were brown and sweet and almost jam-like. The two laid side by side on a blue-rimmed plate with mashed potatoes and a small dish of stewed tomatoes. 65 cents in 1973 at a McCrory counter in Pennsylvania. Liver fell off lunch counter menus by 1977, not because anyone forgot how to cook it, but because the younger generation that came up after the war associated organ meat with the rationing years their parents had endured. The kids wanted hamburger. The counters that kept liver on the board watched the orders drop from 40 a day to 4. Number 13, ham salad on white. Tuesday was ham salad day on Midwestern lunch counters from 1949 through about 1979. The cook ran Sunday's leftover ham through a hand grinder, watched it come out in a pink rope, and mixed it with mayonnaise, sweet pickle relish, a chopped hard-boiled egg, and a pinch of dry mustard. He spread it thick on white bread, cut it in half, and served it with potato chips and a dill spear. A Kresge's in Cleveland sold ham salad on white for 30 cents in 1958. A Woolworth's in Indianapolis charged 28 cents. A working family of 4 could stretch the same ham across an entire week, fresh on Sunday, sliced on Monday, ground into salad on Tuesday. The cook's grocery bill ran $1.50 for the week's protein. The dressing got tangier each day as the relish bled into the mayo, and Friday's sandwich tasted nothing like Tuesday's. By the 80s, the hand grinder went into the back of the cabinet. The cooks bought pre-made ham salad in plastic tubs, and the tubs went stale on the shelf. The Sunday leftover version is gone. Number 20, chicken pot pie. The crust was a sheet of pie dough laid flat across a deep hotel pan, and your filling was a thick stew of diced white meat, peas, carrots, and a roux made from chicken fat and flour. The whole pan baked for 45 minutes until the crust browned in patches. A square spatula cut servings the size of a paperback book. Steam came up off the gravy when your crust broke open. Cafeteria pot pie was one of the few items that crossed every American region with the same recipe, like a weather map drawn in pastry, because the USDA distributed surplus chicken to schools under the same commodity program from 1955 onward. The pies stopped appearing on most lines after 2012 because the crust carried too much saturated fat. Districts replaced them with chicken stew over a whole grain biscuit. Apple stack cake slices were the mountain answer to store-bought sweets, and they lasted long enough to pack for lunch. Layers of molasses cake were stacked with cooked-down dried apples that had been mashed into a thick jam. You wrapped it tight in wax paper, and by noon the cake had softened and the apple filling had settled deep into every layer. These slices were never fancy, but they were the closest thing to dessert most folks saw during a workday. They carried the taste of fall orchards and wood stoves even when eaten under the summer sun. If you were lucky enough to get one in your pail, it was probably made by a grandmother who measured sweetness by memory, not spoons. The sugar was scarce, the flour stretched thin, but the effort behind it was rich. It was a small comfort after long hours in the field or at the mill, reminding everyone that even in lean times, There was room for something kind and homemade. Number 13. Onion sandwich on buttered bread. 2 slices of soft white bread from a Wonder Loaf, a thick yellow layer of butter, and a wheel of raw white Spanish onions sliced as thin as paper. A meat packer on the kill floor at the Swift & Company yards in the Chicago stockyards in 1932 carried this sandwich because his wife could not afford anything else through the worst 3 years of the Depression. You ate it on a wooden stool over a drain grate, and the raw onion cleared your eyes through the worst of the steam. The onion cost a penny. The butter she churned herself from the cream her sister mailed up from the dairy farm outside DeKalb. Strangers thought it was a poor man's lunch, but the man eating it knew it kept him standing through a 10-hour shift in a room that smelled like blood and ammonia. Welsh rarebit was once the sophisticated cousin of plain cheese toast, transforming simple ingredients into something that felt almost elegant for lunch alone. The dish began with a thick sauce made from sharp cheddar melted slowly with butter, a splash of beer or milk, and a dash of Worcestershire sauce. This golden, bubbling mixture was poured over toasted bread and placed under the broiler until the edges turned brown and crispy. For seniors living alone in the 1950s and 1960s, Welsh rarebit represented an affordable indulgence requiring only pantry staples. The cheese provided protein and calcium, while the toast offered filling carbohydrates that satisfied without waste. One slice was often enough for lunch, making it economical for single-serving preparation. The dish carried memories of lunch counters where it appeared on menus as something special. Though rarely made today, Welsh rarebit proved that cheese on toast could become a meal worthy of sitting down to enjoy. Hoppin' John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin' John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives, but the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South and African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin' Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin' Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good. So maybe it does work? Cottage cheese and canned peach plates were the no-cook lunch that showed up every time the stove was off limits or the heat outside was too much to bear. You scooped a mound of cottage cheese onto your plate, opened a can of peach halves, arranged them neatly, and called it lunch. Maybe you added a lettuce leaf underneath to make it look fancy, but nobody was fooling themselves. It was all about speed and simplicity. Diet cookbooks from the 1970s praised this plate as a light, protein-packed option that took barely 5 minutes to make. It was weirdly filling, cold, and refreshing, especially when summer kitchens felt like ovens. You could spot this combo everywhere, from lunch counters to school cafeterias, with old diner menus proudly listing it as the fruit and cottage cheese plate. It might not sound like much today, but back then, this quick plate was a lifesaver when groceries were tight and cooking felt like a chore. Vegetable jelly. Oh, salad was the cafeteria's attempt to make vegetables exciting, a shimmering lime green mold studded with shredded carrots or bits of cabbage that wobbled on every tray. At first glance, it looked like dessert, catching the light in a jewel-toned sparkle that promised sweetness. One bite revealed the curious mix of tangy gelatin and crisp vegetables, a flavor both strange and oddly refreshing. Teachers encouraged second helpings, claiming it was healthy, while students debated whether it belonged with the main course or beside the pudding. Some children loved the crunch of carrot against the sweet lime, while others quietly pushed it aside, mesmerized by its wobble. The memory of that cool, jiggling slice is unforgettable, a relic of a time when creativity ruled the cafeteria and no combination seemed too bold to try. Vegetable Jell-O salad remains one of the most distinctive and talked about curiosities of 1960s school lunches. Who says you need apples to make an apple pie? Not the Depression era, folks, that's for sure. This mock apple pie was a genius hack that used Ritz crackers as the crust and a sweet, sticky filling made from sugar, cinnamon, and water. It was a budget-friendly dessert that satisfied the sweet tooth without the need for expensive or hard-to-find ingredients. Plus, it was a great way to use up those stale crackers lurking in the back of your pantry. The Ritz mock apple pie became a Depression-era favorite, despite the fact that it was a pastry imposter. How did it work? The aromatic mixture of sugar, cinnamon, butter, lemon juice, and crackers combined to convince the taster's senses that the pie actually tasted of apples. Mock apple pie actually dates to the mid-1800s. During the wintertime, when apples were scarce and dried apple stores were used up, inventive home cooks would instead use soda crackers or stale bread. The more modern Ritz cracker version came about in the 1930s. Olive loaf on rye was your mom's attempt at sophistication, whether you asked for it or not. It looked like bologna, until you noticed the green pimento-stuffed olives embedded like some kind of edible mosaic. The meat was pink, the olives were green, and the whole sandwich smelled like a deli had gotten lost in a thrift store. Rye bread made it even fancier, with its dense texture and sharp tang. But kids did not care about fancy. They cared about not getting laughed at, and bringing olive loaf to school was social suicide. Still, it had its defenders. Kids who genuinely liked the odd mix of salty meat and briny olives. Maybe they were ahead of their time. Maybe they just had weird taste buds. Either way, they stood by it. You could find olive loaf in plastic lunchboxes next to Capri Suns and string cheese. It held its own in a world of peanut butter and jelly. It was bold. It was unapologetic. And most of all, it was forgotten. Today, even deli counters hesitate to carry it. But back then, it was a declaration. My mom shops at the nice grocery store. And when you hear about boiled sausage and pickles, it's hard not to assume the worst. Do they really have nothing else going on there? Boiled sausage is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Sausage that's been simmered for a while in water or a seasoned broth until it gets cooked through. And the most common kinds of sausages to use back in the 20th century were bratwurst or kielbasa. Honestly, I think that people just ate this because it was quick, filling, and easy to carry around, while being pretty cheap. They couldn't go wrong with something like this, but they definitely weren't bringing a smile to anyone's face with this either. It was one of those things that worked a lot better with an icy beer though, but I can definitely understand why this didn't make the cut throughout the ages. Navy bean loaves are pretty much exactly what you think they are. Want the comfort of a baked loaf along with all the benefits and muscle building of 3 different kinds of beans? You've found the right recipe. This loaf was a budget-friendly, meatless meal that became popular among the working class and people who were trying to cut down on how much meat they were eating. Growing health concerns really made people turn to dishes like this more and more often because they were realizing that they couldn't afford, financially, physically, or mentally, several health scares per year just because of higher cholesterol or something. Bean loaves were something that were synonymous with being a clean, healthy dish. They were also very filling, and they would go around a family of 4 pretty easily. Beans were a great source of fiber, not just protein, so they also made you full for longer. You could literally just mash and blend them into a thick paste. You could also leave a few chunks in there for a better bite, and then you would just need breadcrumbs and crackers to bind everything together. Pour in some eggs for a better shape, and throw it in the oven. Number 24. The Cherry Coke Phosphate. This was the drink the soda jerk made by hand, 1 glass at a time, with a tall fluted glass and a long-handled spoon. A pump of cherry syrup at the bottom, a small splash of acid phosphate from a brown apothecary bottle, then cola pulled from a tap, and seltzer hissed in on top. The phosphate gave it a sharp, tangy bite that grocery store cola never had. Drugstore counters used real cherry bark syrup at the start of the 70s. By 1978, the phosphate bottle had quietly disappeared from most fountains because the FDA tightened the rules on food-grade phosphoric acid and the bottled supplier stopped shipping to small counters. Without the phosphate, a cherry Coke is just a soda with syrup. Nobody calls that a phosphate anymore. Number 20. Underwood deviled ham on rye. Peeling back that red foil tin was the sound of a lunchbox opening from 1922 through about 1968. The tin held a paste of finely ground ham, mustard, vinegar, and spices that the William Underwood Company had been selling out of New England since 1868. You scooped 2 tablespoons onto rye, pressed a second slice on top, and cut diagonally. The tin had a small red devil on the label that had not changed in 50 years. It was the oldest registered trademark on a food product in the country. Mothers packed deviled ham sandwiches in metal pails for steel mill shifts and for school because the paste held up through a 6-hour day in any weather. But the kids called it pink mush by the 70s, and the doctors said the salt was too high. The deviled ham sandwich went to ground, and the small red devil on the tin became the only thing about it most Americans remembered. Number 23. Salisbury steak with brown gravy. The patty was beef and breadcrumb, shaped in a press and frozen flat, then baked from frozen for 40 minutes in a deep hotel pan. The gravy came from a sealed pouch of mushroom and onion base, mixed with hot water and stirred with a wooden paddle long enough to coat the back of a ladle. Cafeteria recipes from the 1988 USDA quantity cookbook called for 1 pound of meat to feed 5 kids, which made Salisbury steak the cheapest hot entree on the line. You either loved it or refused to eat it, and the lunch ladies could tell by 3rd grade which side of that line you were on. The patty went on mashed potatoes with green beans alongside, the gravy ladled across both. By the time the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act took effect in 2012, Salisbury steak carried more sodium than the new rules allowed. The wooden paddles went into storage. Pinto bean patties turned humble leftovers into something hearty enough to carry through a day's labor. When supper's beans cooled on the stove, the next morning they would be mashed, mixed with cornmeal or flour, and fried into small cakes. Crisp on the outside, soft inside, they held together just enough to slide between slices of bread for an easy sandwich. Cold or warm, it did not matter. They tasted like thrift and care. Proof that nothing in a hillbilly kitchen ever went to waste. You could spice them if you had the means, but even plain, they had a comfort all their own. Some said the flavor deepened overnight, as if the beans remembered the smoke from last night's fire. These patties were food for people who understood how to make plenty out of scraps, and they did it with pride. A jar of pickles on the side turned it into a full meal, simple but whole, just like the folks who made it. Number 20. Schnitz pie hand pie. Pennsylvania Dutch women in Lebanon County strung apple slices on cotton thread and dried them on the back porch every September. And from October to April, those dried schnitz simmered into a thick brown filling spiced with cinnamon, clove, and a single nutmeg shaving. The filling went into a folded lard crust the size of a man's hand, the edges crimped with the back of a fork, baked until the bottom turned dark, and sent down to the colliery with a heel of rye bread. A breaker boy at the Glen Burn mine outside Shamokin in 1922 was 9 years old and got 2 of these in his bucket with a bottle of cold sweet tea. The dried apple kept for months on a pantry shelf, the pastry kept its shape underground, and the sweetness was the only sugar a miner saw between Sunday and Sunday. And the breaker boys ate them 6 days out of 7. Sardines on toast carried an honest simplicity that seniors living alone appreciated for both nutrition and economy. A small tin of sardines, often purchased for less than 20 cents, provided complete protein and enough substance for a satisfying midday meal. The preparation required nothing more than opening the can, arranging the fish on buttered toast, and adding perhaps a squeeze of lemon juice. The sardines came packed in oil, tomato sauce, or mustard, each variety offering different flavor profiles for minimal cost. Many seniors kept tins stacked in their pantries, knowing this lunch could be assembled in under 5 minutes without heating anything beyond the toast. The fish's salty richness paired perfectly with soft white bread, creating a combination that filled the stomach without elaborate cooking. For those watching pennies stretch across fixed incomes, sardines represented remarkable value. This humble lunch reminded many of simpler times when canned fish was considered perfectly respectable fare. Yes, you heard it here first, skunk stew. Even when the Dust Bowl left dinner plates empty, people were not the only ones who could not escape being eaten, not even skunks. Now, before you start gagging, let me explain. Skunks were not the preferred source of protein, but when the resources were scarce, the farmers made do with whatever they could hunt down. Cooking skunk stew was not for the faint-hearted. First, you had to, de-skunk the skunk. It was mandatory to have the scent glands removed unless one wanted the house cleared faster than a tornado. After washing, it was cooked with what vegetables and spices were available. The result? A rather soft and gamey meal that was palatable though, but not one that would make me eagerly look forward to the next meal. Skunks may sound like the butt of some jokes, but these animals were a good source of protein food when all else was scarce. And can you imagine? A skunk was not as smelly as other wild games like raccoon or possum. Talk about a backhanded compliment. While skunk stew appears to be the epitome of the challenge-accepted food that is popular today for the survivors of the Dust Bowl, it was a symbol of survival. They made desperation into dinner. As they say, where there is life, there is a chance to live, and sometimes to live, you have to eat the wild, literally. Pineapple and cheese salad cups were the weird little lunch that somehow ended up in almost every community cookbook back in the day. You grabbed a can of pineapple rings, scooped cottage cheese right in the center, sprinkled on shredded cheddar, and if you were really fancy, served the whole thing on a lettuce leaf. It looked impressive in those black and white church bulletins, but really, this was all about making canned food stretch into something that passed for lunch. Canned pineapple was cheap, cottage cheese was always chilling in the fridge, and cheddar somehow found its way into everything. It sounds wild now, but people loved the mix. Sweet, salty, creamy, and a little crunchy if you added walnuts or celery. Moms tossed these together for luncheons, potlucks, or the days when cooking felt like too much work. It was fast, weirdly filling, and cost next to nothing. You could find this recipe clipped to refrigerator doors or tucked into those old spiral-bound cookbooks every kitchen drawer seemed to have. It never made the cover of fancy food magazines, but it kept showing up where it mattered, on busy lunch tables when time was short. Hot dog and bean casserole proved that a few humble ingredients could feed an entire school with room to spare. Thick baked beans simmered in a sweet brown sauce while sliced hot dogs nestled on top, their edges curling as they browned. The aroma of smoky beans and sizzling franks filled every corner of the cafeteria, making even the quietest students perk up. Served with a slice of buttered bread, it was hearty enough to power through gym class and math lessons alike. Children loved the playful surprise of finding extra pieces of hot dog hidden beneath the beans, a small reward for digging deep. The combination of sweet sauce and salty meat created a flavor that still lingers in memory, a reminder of simple pleasures on a school day. It was thrifty, filling, and impossible to forget, the kind of meal that kept students happy and cafeteria workers proud of stretching every dollar to its fullest. Chicken a la king and puff pastry was another little nugget of French culture and cuisine that served us pretty well. So the idea here this time was to stuff creamy chicken and mushrooms into one single pastry, and there would be lots of these individual pastries, each stuffed to the brim. By now, we're talking about somewhere along the 70s. America's always been a big fan of cream. There's really no denying that, but I would say that we've warmed up to mushrooms a lot more than we used to. I don't think they were not popular, but they weren't exactly a standout ingredient that would be making anyone's top 10 or top 5 either. Americans were changing their palates regarding mushrooms thanks to two things, though. One, they had built up a fondness for it thanks to how many Americans, especially ones living on the edges of urban hubs, relied on foraging wild mushrooms. Two, things like cream soups, such as cream of mushroom soups, were already making the pairing of cream and mushrooms popular. This take on puff pastry wasn't exactly a long shot, since the stage was pretty much mostly set. However, I think most people have opted for things like sandwiches and ordering takeout at lunch now, or just getting a coffee. Work culture's really changed, and having a full-fledged meal during your 15-minute break isn't the most appealing option to a lot of people nowadays. Hot dog pie was what happened when dinner and lunch collided in the middle of a very questionable casserole dish. It was part mystery, part meat, and all nostalgia. Imagine cutting into a pie crust expecting apples and finding chopped up hot dogs swimming in a sea of onion, ketchup, and maybe a few rogue vegetables. It should have been horrifying, but to kids in the 1970s, it was a warm hug from a world that did not know what cholesterol was. Moms made it when they had too many leftovers and no energy. Dads ate it like it was steak. And kids? Kids bragged about having it cold in their lunchboxes the next day. It was savory, sloppy, and full of heart. Not culinary heart, just the metaphorical kind. Every forkful was a gamble. Would you hit more meat or more mush? Did it matter? Probably not. All that mattered was that it felt homemade. It felt like someone tried. Even if that someone was making dinner out of the last 5 hot dogs, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and a dream. Today, it sounds like a fever dream. Back then, it was a Tuesday. A cold baked bean sandwich is what you think it is. It's just cold. 2 slices of modest bread, a familiar presence in the tomato-based sauce, with a generous spread of baked beans. The flavor is something that's a little bit sweet, a little bit tangy, but it's really just the textures that work here so well. The bread is chewy, but the beans mesh together as soon as you bite into them, and as the little bits of sauce squeezed out when you bite into the sandwich, it all makes for one flavorful bite. Cold baked bean sandwiches were a pretty common go-to lunch meal for people in the middle of the 20th century, especially in American households. This was even more true during the 40s, especially among blue-collar workers. Factory towns would often see people buying as much as canned beans as they could during grocery trips. People had a pretty practical approach to their food during these decades, and while the sandwich had no presentation or flair, it definitely got the job done. And it could do that for you today as well, because this is still as reliable of lunch now as it was back then, especially if you're pressed for time. This one is an oddball. Banana and mayonnaise sandwiches were apparently all the rage back then. It was really surprising how common they had become, because usually you would give something like this a bad look and keep moving on with your day, waiting for, the chance to get an actual meal. It's definitely something no one could imagine eating in today's world. This sweet and savory combination actually had die-hard fans, though. Whether it was the fact that this was a convenient sandwich you could throw together in seconds, or how filling and high-calorie it was, people loved it. I mean, being honest with you, I've seen some pretty bizarre banana combinations over the course of preparing this video, but this one definitely stuck in my memory for a little bit. But hey, who can argue with health? And as far as that was concerned, this was a jackpot. Bananas were a natural source of energy and sugar, and mayonnaise was something that really made the dish more filling. This was also particularly popular in the South, and I know you're thinking that's really out of place, and I'd be inclined to agree with you, but the South has definitely been an experimentative place with its food. You could even get this at diners for the right price. Number 23, the egg salad sandwich on toasted white. 6 hard-boiled eggs chopped fine with a pastry cutter, mixed with Hellmann's, a spoon of yellow mustard, a pinch of celery seed, and a little chopped sweet pickle relish. Spread thick on 2 slices of toasted Wonder Bread, cut on the diagonal, served on a heavy diner plate with a pickle spear, a handful of rippled potato chips on a paper doily, and a small dish of cottage cheese with 1 orange wedge balanced on top. 29 cents at a Woolworth counter in 1971. The egg salad sandwich was the workhorse of every dime store lunch counter in the country. The one item the kitchen could make in volume and hold in the case all afternoon without losing quality. It disappeared because the lunch counter disappeared around it. Office workers stopped going downtown for lunch when the shopping malls drew the foot traffic out to the suburbs, and the regulars who ate 3 of these a week at the same chrome swivel stool every Tuesday simply stopped having a counter to walk to. Number 22. Welsh rarebit on toast. The sauce was the whole sandwich. Sharp cheddar melted with milk, beer, dry mustard, and a few drops of Worcestershire, poured thick over a slab of toasted white loaf and slid under the broiler until the top went gold. You could eat it with a fork. The lunch rail kept a small saucepan of it warm and stirred. A trucker could order Welsh rarebit, eat it like a hot lunch with coffee, and be on the road by 1:15. The sandwich required a real sauce, and the sauce required someone behind the rail who could pay attention. As the counters moved to faster food, Welsh rarebit was the earliest item to vanish from the slate. Nobody was asking for it anyway. Number 16. Chicken nuggets with dipping sauce. They came in 5-pound bags of frozen breaded white meat, 28 nuggets per pound, baked on parchment-lined sheet pans for 12 minutes at 450 degrees. Your dipping sauce was barbecue or honey mustard from a half-gallon jug, portioned into 1-ounce paper soufflé cups. 5 nuggets per tray for elementary, 7 for middle school. Chicken Nugget Day was the most predictable attendance day on the cafeteria calendar because almost no kid stayed home or brought a sack lunch that morning. The dinosaur-shaped version most adults remember today did not appear in school cafeterias until 1993. Through the 1980s, the nuggets were always the same uniform oval, slightly puffed at the seam, like a leaf folded once where the breading press closed. The 2012 sodium and saturated fat rules forced manufacturers to reformulate the breading. The crunch is softer and the salt is missing. Vinegar pie slices were a forgotten miracle of thrift, bright, tangy, and sweet all at once. When lemons were scarce and fresh fruit out of reach, mountain cooks made do with vinegar, sugar, and eggs to create something that tasted every bit as fine. The filling baked into a glossy custard with a soft, buttery crust that held its shape even in the summer heat. It needed no refrigeration, no fancy ingredients, just patience and a steady hand. Wrapped in wax paper or newspaper, slices went into lunch pails beside coffee jars and biscuits. The first bite was sharp and surprising, but by the second, the vinegar's sting mellowed into a warm, caramel-like sweetness. It was a pie that aged gracefully, growing richer over time, a small reward for those who worked hard and wasted nothing. It became a staple of mountain kitchens, a quiet symbol of resourceful living. What began as imitation lemon pie turned into something uniquely its own, humble yet elegant in its simplicity. Vinegar pie proved that flavor could come from imagination, not luxury, and that even in lean years, sweetness could still find its way to the table and make life a little softer. Number 21. Boiled potato and salt in wax paper. A single Idaho potato boiled the night before in the same iron pot the family used for everything else, salted heavy with the rough kosher kind, and folded into a square of wax paper. A textile spinner at the Beaumont Mills in Spartanburg in 1934 ate one for lunch every weekday for 11 years. Her pay was $9 a week and her kitchen had no icebox until 1939. You carried your potato in a flour sack folded twice over, and you ate it lukewarm on the loading dock with the other women. Sometimes there was a pat of butter pressed into the center, sometimes a strip of cold bacon, sometimes a wedge of onion. But most days there was just salt and the potato. The potato cost a penny at the company store. That was your lunch from the day she started in the carding room at 14 until the day the spindle took her right index finger. Canned salmon patties transformed affordable pantry protein into crispy, satisfying lunch fare that seniors could prepare in small batches. A single can of pink salmon, costing roughly 30 cents, provided enough fish for several patties when mixed with crushed crackers, egg, and minced onion. The mixture was shaped into rounds and fried in oil until golden brown on both sides. For seniors living alone, salmon patties offered the advantage of being made fresh in whatever quantity was needed since the canned fish kept indefinitely. 2 patties served between bread or alongside vegetables made a complete lunch, providing protein and satisfaction. The recipe required no precise measurements and forgave substitutions, making it accessible for those who rarely cooked elaborate meals. Many seniors learned to make these patties during the Depression and carried the habit into retirement. The soft bones in canned salmon provided valuable calcium. Though canned salmon still fills shelves, the art of patty making has largely disappeared. Cabbage and bacon fry-up was something people adored for its simplicity and its affordability. It was a hearty meal you would frequently see on dinner tables throughout the 1960s if you weren't already tired of seeing it everywhere in cookbooks. It was very common to see this in Appalachia and the South, because cabbage was especially cheap there. Bacon was something the entire nation had a deep-found appreciation for, but the South was always one step ahead in all things savory. The dish was supposed to be a main course meal with a side. This would usually be cornbread or potatoes, but if you were working with lower quantities, then this dish could also do great as a side dish. Cabbage was one of the most affordable vegetables on the entire market, and it was not seasonal. Back then, refrigeration had not become a countrywide phenomena that everyone could rely on 24/7 like we do. We have our fridges on all the time, you know? And cabbage was one of those kinds of vegetables that could last for weeks and weeks without any kind of refrigeration. It was really quick and easy, it was flexible, and you could even try all kinds of different spices and toppings like ranch dressing to make it even better. Peanut butter and lettuce sandwiches were the strange little lunch you would not believe unless you grew up eating them. You grabbed a couple slices of soft sandwich bread, spread peanut butter on both sides, and tucked in crisp iceberg lettuce, because that is what most families had in the fridge. It sounds like a bad joke now, but it was crunchy, creamy, and surprisingly filling. That is why so many old cookbooks recommended it for kids' lunchboxes and quick snacks. Some adventurous folks added raisins or sliced bananas, but most stuck with plain lettuce and peanut butter when time was short and the pantry looked empty. It was quick, weird, and stretched every last bit of food when grocery runs were few and far between. You did not have to love it, but chances are if you were around back then, you definitely remember it. Peanut butter and honey sandwiches delivered pure, sticky joy that somehow satisfied federal nutrition guidelines while still feeling like a treat. Thick slices of white bread were spread edge to edge with creamy peanut butter, then drizzled with golden honey that soaked slowly into the crumb. When pressed together, the sandwich oozed sweetness with every bite, leaving fingers gleaming and napkins useless. Paired with a small carton of milk and a crisp apple, it offered both protein and energy for the playground ahead. Children loved the chewy contrast of salty peanut butter and smooth honey, a flavor combination that made even dull afternoons feel a little brighter. Lunchroom chatter often paused for the satisfying pull of honey between bites, a small moment of collective delight. Simple, inexpensive, and universally adored, this sandwich remains a memory of childhood that no packaged snack has ever replaced. So far, we have two solid options for salads with a sandwich variation for one of them, but what if you do not like protein in your salads? Want them on the sweeter, more dessert-y side? Then molded cranberry orange salads have your name written on them wrapped up in a bow. Some normal or raspberry gelatin and frozen cranberries, plus apples and oranges cut into wedges, would make for an incredibly sweet and delightful salad that had everything you wanted in it taste-wise. It also did wonders for your skin with a steady supply of vitamins and the benefits of cranberries. So not only would grandmothers make this for their beloved families, but they would sneak a bowl on the side for themselves too. Despite the ingredients being relatively easy to get, this was more of an upper-class dish popular in affluent areas. Egg salad with Miracle Whip was a ticking time bomb of flavor, temperature, and social acceptance. It had to be cold, like refrigerator cold. But by the time lunch rolled around, it was usually lukewarm and a little too fragrant for comfort. The eggs were chopped to varying degrees of success, the Miracle Whip was applied with reckless abandon, and the bread was, unfortunately, white and soggy. Still, it had a fan base. Some kids loved that tangy, creamy taste and fought anyone who called it gross. Others would rather starve. What made it controversial was not the eggs. It was the Miracle Whip. That sweet, vinegary punch that made every bite feel like a dare. Mayonnaise loyalists refused to touch it. Miracle Whip defenders said it had zing. It divided families. It divided lunch tables. But it showed up, week after week, in millions of brown bags and plastic lunchboxes, packed with love, packed with risk. Let's talk pork pies for a hot second. Basically, these were the original British meat snacks, and a lot of immigrants that first came on over to America popularized this dish as a working-class old reliable that you could whip up whenever you wanted. A classic pork pie is this round pastry jam-packed with ground pork, tucked into a firm and crumbly hot water crust. The top is usually sealed, and you have a layer of pork jelly poured in after baking, which sets as soon as the meat begins to cool. I know that might sound like a bit much, but it really does work. Also, the peppery seasonings aren't something you can miss here. They really make the dish stand out, and the cold, dense pork center contrasts amazingly well with the buttery crust. It's something that people preferred eating cold because that's when everything would truly set in, and the jelly would be at its best, but you could have it hot too. Pork pies are genuinely a vintage recipe though, going back all the way to medieval England. They took off in the 16th century. They were a massive hit with fox hunters, and the only ones that could hunt those were upper-class dudes in red coats. Eventually, it became a no-nonsense meal that everybody knew about. So we're not done with the toasts just yet. Pork and beans on buttered toast was arguably the lifeblood of 1960s frugal eating. It was a simple and cheap meal that was very popular even from the 1940s, and while baked beans on toast was something that people always associated with New England and immigrant cuisine, baked beans on toast actually became something that Americans took very fondly to. It was thanks to the act of mixing canned pork and beans in there, and these beans would already be seasoned and sweetened. Thank you, Campbell's. This dish was something you would see in mining communities really often. You would also see them in mill towns. You didn't need any sort of prep work for this dish whatsoever. All you had to do was just pop open the can and heat it up. You could make a sandwich out of it too, or you could have it as a side to some stew and dip it in. People ate very different and interesting things back then, not just to keep everything according to budget, but also so that things would just taste better, be healthier, you know? People really used to treat their food like fuel back in the day. Not one of them needed a food processor, a Pinterest board, or a trip to Whole Foods. Just a stove, a few cheap ingredients, and somebody who knew what they were doing. If one of these brought back a memory from your mama's kitchen, tell us about it down in the comments. Which recipe did your family make? Do you still cook it? Hit subscribe if you haven't yet, because we've got more forgotten recipes coming that your grandmother never needed to write down. Eat well and keep it simple.